He grabbed her wrist so hard, she felt the bones grind together. That was the last night Zurielle Baptiste let Corbin Dacker put his hands on her. She packed one bag. She didn't look back. She told herself it was over. She was wrong. 3 weeks later, white roses appeared on her desk. At work, no card, no name, just a small key tag from an apartment she no longer lived in. And in that moment, standing in the middle of one of the most powerful corporate offices in San Francisco, surrounded by men who would burn the city down if their boss gave the word, Zurielle Baptiste realized that leaving a man like Corbin didn't end the danger. It started a different kind. If you've ever had to disappear from someone who refused to let you go, someone who called it love while they were doing it, then you already know what this story costs. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The coffee mug hit the floor on a Monday. That was how it started, not with a confession, not with a confrontation, not with Zurielle finally breaking down in someone's office and asking for help. It started with a ceramic mug slipping from her fingers because her left hand had gone slightly numb, the way it sometimes did when she'd slept wrong on her wrist or when the bruising underneath her sleeve pressed against the fabric for too long. The mug shattered across the polished floor of the executive suite on the 31st floor of Hanul Pacific Group headquarters tower, and was loud enough that Baek Ji-hwan looked up from the contract he was reading. He didn't say anything at first. That was one of the things people who didn't know him always got wrong. They expected a man in his position to fill silences. Ji-hwan didn't fill silences. He let them sit there and watched what crawled out of them. Zurielle crouched immediately, collecting the broken pieces with her bare hands, her right sleeve staying where it was, her left sleeve sliding back maybe 2 inches. 2 inches was enough. Ji-hwan saw the bruising before she corrected the sleeve. Purple-yellow at the edges, darker toward the center of her inner wrist, the kind of mark that doesn't come from walking into a door frame or catching your arm on a cabinet. He had seen enough injuries in his life to know what a grip looked like when it left its shape behind on someone's skin. He set the contract down. Zurielle straightened up with the broken pieces cupped in her palm and walked to his wastebasket without looking at him. She said. She said it the way she said most things directly, without softening it, without the nervous qualifier that most people added when they were bracing for pushback. She wasn't asking his permission. She was stating a condition. Ji-hwan picked the contract back up. I wasn't going to. That was a lie, and she probably knew it, but it was the kind of lie that functioned as courtesy, and Zurielle accepted it the same way. She ordered a replacement mug from the kitchen downstairs, returned to her desk outside his office door, and they spent the rest of the morning working the same way they always did, efficiently, professionally. With the particular rhythm two people develop after nearly 3 years of sitting across from each other's habits and silences. But Ji-hwan didn't stop seeing the bruises just because they were hidden again. He started noticing things that week that he'd filed away without flagging. On Tuesday, Zurielle took the east elevator instead of the main bank, even though the east elevator was slower and required a longer walk from the parking structure. On Wednesday, she arrived 9 minutes earlier than usual, and when he asked her to pull a file from the storage room on the floor below, she took the stairs down but the elevator back up, the opposite of her usual pattern. On Thursday, she spent 40 seconds looking out the window before she answered a question he'd asked her, and when he followed her eyeline, he saw nothing remarkable on the street below except the ordinary traffic of a midweek afternoon. By Friday, Ji-hwan had a quiet conversation with his head of building security about the camera coverage on floors 30 through 33. He didn't tell Zurielle he'd done that. He told himself it wasn't surveillance. He told himself he was simply doing what any responsible executive did when something in his environment changed without explanation. He told himself a lot of things that week. What he didn't tell himself, because Ji-hwan was whatever else he was, honest with himself about his own motivations, was that the bruises had made him angry in a way that very little made him angry anymore. Not the cold, strategic anger that he used for business. The other kind, The kind that sat in your chest and didn't have a clean direction. The roses arrived on Friday afternoon. Zurielle was at her desk, reviewing a vendor contract when the building receptionist called up to say there was a floral delivery. Standard procedure for the executive floor was to hold all deliveries at reception until Zurielle cleared them. She'd established that protocol herself 18 months ago as a security measure, and at the time no one had asked why. She went down herself instead of sending a courier. She was back in 14 minutes, and she came through the door of the executive suite with a medium-sized arrangement of white roses in a plain glass vase, her face carrying the particular expression of someone maintaining composure through deliberate muscle control rather than actual calm. Ji-hwan watched her set the vase on the edge of her desk and reach into the center of the arrangement. She pulled out a small plastic key tag, the kind apartment complexes used to use before digital fobs became standard rectangular, with a printed address and a unit number. She stared at it for 4 seconds, then closed her fingers around it. Ji-hwan said, "Who sent them?" It wasn't a question. Zurielle looked up. "There's no card. There doesn't need to be one for you to know." She looked at the key tag in her hand, then at him, and for a moment, something shifted behind her eyes, not panic, but a recalibration, the expression of someone deciding how much truth to trade out for safety. "I'm handling it," she said. "Zurielle, I said I'm handling it." She set the key tag down on her desk precisely the way she set everything down, like placing it mattered. Personal situation. It won't affect work. Ji-hwan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the bruises. He thought about the changed elevator pattern. He thought about the 40 seconds she'd spent looking at the street on Thursday afternoon. "All right," he said. He went back into his office. He called his head of security from the private line on his desk and told him to pull the external camera footage for the blocks surrounding the building, starting from the moment the delivery arrived. That evening, Ji-hwan stayed late. He told himself he had contracts to review, which was true. He told himself the security footage was routine, which was also technically true. He was on the phone with his attorney about a shipping dispute when his security chief, a man named Park Sung-min, who had worked for Ji-hwan for 11 years and knew better than to bring him speculation, walked into the office and set a tablet on the desk. On the screen, a dark sedan parked on the far side of the intersection across from the building entrance. It had been there since approximately 2 in the afternoon. A sound like green wood splitting, it was still there at 6:15, which was approximately when Zurielle's car service picked her up at the building's side entrance, a route she'd apparently arranged, without requesting it through the standard scheduling system, which meant she'd booked it through her personal account. The sedan followed the car service for 3 blocks, then turned south. Ji-hwan looked at the tablet for a while without speaking. Then he told Sung-shin to run the plates. He went home that night and did not sleep particularly well, which was not something that happened to him often. Plates came back to a vehicle registered to a rental company in Oakland, paid for with a credit card belonging to a man named Corbin Dacre. Ji-hwan spent approximately 6 minutes with that name on a piece of paper in front of him before he made any calls. He had people who could tell him everything there was to know about Corbin Dacre within 2 hours. His address, his work history, his finances, his family, who he talked to, and what he was afraid of. He had other people who could make a quiet trip to wherever Corbin Dacre was currently sleeping and ensure that this particular problem resolved itself before the following morning without creating any documentation that could be traced back to Hanul Pacific Group or anyone associated with it. He had those options. He had always had those options. They were effective and they were permanent, and they were the kind of solution that fit cleanly inside the framework he'd operated in for 20 years. He didn't make those calls. He wasn't entirely sure why that first night. He told himself it was strategic, that disappearing someone whose connection to his executive secretary might eventually surface created exposure he didn't need. That was true enough to be a reason. But when he sat with it honestly, at 11:30 at night in a house that was very quiet, he thought it might also be something else. Something to do with the way Zurielle had said, "I'm handling it." Not "I need help," or "make it stop," or "tell me what to do." Handling it. like she had a process already underway, and the last thing she needed was someone else inserting their judgment into the middle of it. He thought about that for a while. Then he went to bed. Monday morning, Zurielle arrived and immediately began a meeting preparation document for a Thursday board review. She was 6 minutes into it when Ji-hwan opened his office door and told her he needed to meet about something unrelated to work. She set her pen down very carefully. He told her about the sedan. He told her about the plates. He told her the name. She didn't look surprised by any of it. She looked like someone confirming information they'd already calculated. His name is Corbin Dacre, she said. He's my former boyfriend. We ended things 6 weeks ago. He hasn't accepted that. Ji-hwan waited. The bruises, she continued, are from the last night we were together. He physically prevented me from leaving. I left anyway. The room was quiet for a moment. I want to be clear about something, Zurielle said. She was looking directly at him, which she always did, but there was a particular quality to it now. I know what you're thinking about doing. I know what resources you have available. And I am telling you right now, as clearly as I can, that I do not want that. Not any version of it. Ji-hwan said, he's following you. I know. He sent the flowers. I know. He has someone giving him access to your schedule, or he's figured out your patterns on his own. Something shifted in Zurielle's expression when he said that. Not surprise exactly, but the look of someone whose suspicion had just been given a specific shape. What makes you say that? She asked. Because the delivery arrived at a time that suggested he knew when you'd be at your desk. And the sedan was positioned before your car service arrived, which means he knew you were using the site's exit. Zurielle was quiet for a moment. That's a problem, she said finally. Yes, but it's a problem I intend to address through legal channels. Documentation, attorneys, police involvement at the appropriate time, a protective order. She paused. No intimidation, no surveillance of him without my knowledge. No violence. Nothing happens regarding my safety that I don't know about and approve. Ji-hwan looked at her. She looked back at him. Those are the rules, she said. He could have argued. He had spent 2 decades in an environment where the people around him did not establish the terms of his protection. He could have pointed out that her approach had risks and timelines and legal processes that didn't move at the speed that threats moved, and that if something happened to her in the gap between filing paperwork and a judge signing an order, no documentation would undo that. He could have said all of that. Instead, he said, "All right?" Zurielle nodded once, picked her pen back up, and returned to the meeting preparation document. The internal security review turned up Von Mercer inside of 4 days. Ji-hwan's security team had run a quiet access audit across the executive scheduling systems framed on paper as a routine cybersecurity review following a vendor compliance update. It was the kind of administrative cover story that Von Mercer, as a senior operations manager with 17 years at Hanul Pacific Group, would not have looked at twice. The audit showed that over the previous 11 weeks, Von's credentials had accessed Zurielle's executive calendar, her emergency contact file, and her residential information profile 7 times outside of any business function that would have required it. 7 times in 11 weeks was not curiosity. It was a system. Ji-hwan reviewed the logs himself. He looked at the timestamps, the specific files opened, the duration of each access. Then he looked at the dates and laid them against a separate list Sungmin had compiled. Dates when Corbin Dacre's sedan had appeared on external cameras near the building. Dates of the anonymous message deliveries. The date of the flower arrangement. The overlap was not perfect, but it didn't need to be. There was enough. He brought the information to Zurielle. She read through it at her desk, and he watched her work through it. In stages, the initial recognition, then the specific memory surfacing behind her eyes, then something that looked like a very cold and focused anger. "Von Mercer," she said. "You know him. I filed an internal compliance report on a contract irregularity in his division 14 months ago. It triggered a review that nearly cost him his position." She set the folder down. "He's been doing this since before the flowers." "Yes. He's been feeding Corbin my address and schedule for months. That's what the access pattern suggests." Zurielle looked at the folder for a moment. I want to test it before we move on him. If we pull his access and he realizes we know, Corbin finds another source. If there's another source, Ji-hwan said, what kind of test? Plant a false location in a schedule he can reach. Somewhere specific enough that Corbin would have to act on it if he received the information. Then see if Corbin shows up. Ji-hwan thought about it. It was a clean method. It minimized exposure and created confirmation without depending on Vaughn's cooperation or confession. I can have that set up within 48 hours, he said. Then let's do it. She looked up at him. And nothing happens to Vaughn until we have confirmation. He goes through HR and legal, the same as anyone else. No side procedures. Ji-hwan nodded. The false schedule went into the system on a Wednesday. A fictional meeting at a law office in the Mission District. 11 o'clock Thursday morning, Zurielle listed as the attendee. At 10:47 on Thursday, Corbin Dacre's rental car was photographed by a traffic camera 2 blocks from the address. Zurielle, who had spent the morning at her actual desk reviewing a procurement contract, received the photograph via text from Sungmin. She looked at it for a moment, then set her phone face down on her desk and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Confirmed, she said finally. Yes, Ji-hwan said. Pull Vaughn's access today. Legal team handles his termination. I don't want him escorted out by security in a way that signals anything to the broader staff before HR has completed the documentation. Ji-hwan made the call. Vaughn Mercer's keycard stopped working at 2:17 that afternoon. By Thursday evening, Hanul Pacific's general counsel had a termination package drafted and a separate referral to an outside employment attorney for a potential civil claim related to unauthorized data access. Vaughn would be gone before Monday. The second message arrived, Friday evening. Zurielle was still at her desk at 6:45, which was later than usual, which she had not announced to anyone, when her personal phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered out of reflex. There was no voice. Just the sound of a street, traffic, a distant horn, someone laughing too loudly. And then Corbin's voice, quiet and entirely conversational. You look tired. Long week? She looked out the window. 5 blocks away, a man was standing on a street corner with a phone to his ear. She couldn't see his face from this distance. She couldn't be certain it was him. But she knew. She ended the call, set the phone on her desk, and sat completely still for a moment. Then she picked it up again and called her attorney. She'd given Vaughn's access and the false schedule test as confirmation. She had Sungmin's photographs. She had the original flower delivery, the key tag, the previous anonymous messages, the access logs. All of it had gone to her attorney's office in organized files across the past 2 weeks. Now she had a phone call and a man on a street corner who knew she was still in the building. Vaughn was gone. He hadn't sent this. She said that out loud to Ji-hwan when he passed her desk on his way out at 7, and he stopped. Vaughn's access was pulled at 2:17, he said. I know. This came at 6:45. She held up her phone. He knew I was still here. He knew which direction to look. And Vaughn didn't tell him. Ji-hwan stood there. There's someone else, Zurielle said. The words landed in the quiet office, like something heavy being set on a glass table. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ji-hwan said quietly, Yes. It appears there is. Span-in wood splitting, and from somewhere underneath her careful composure, Zurielle felt a particular kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of having done everything right, and discovered that the problem was larger than the solution she'd already built. She put the phone back in her bag, gathered her files, and stood up. Then we find them, she said. She walked to the elevator, pressed the call button, and waited with her shoulders square and her face carrying nothing that anyone watching from the street below would have been able to read. Ji-hwan watched her go and thought that whatever Corbin Dacre had imagined he was dealing with when he pointed a camera at this building and hired someone inside it to bleed information about her life, he had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had mistaken composure for vulnerability. He would eventually understand that mistake. But not yet. The second source had a name by Saturday morning. Ji-hwan got the call at 6:41, before he'd finished his first cup of coffee, from Sungmin, who did not call at 6:41 unless the information couldn't wait. He listened for 90 seconds without speaking, set the cup down, and said, "Don't move on him yet." Then he ended the call and sat with it for a while. Ellis Wardell, 26 years old, Junior Executive Coordinator, 18 months at Hanul Pacific Group. Assigned through a standard recruitment, hired through standard background checks, cleared through standard background checks, assigned to the Operations Support Division that Zurielle had partially overseen during his onboarding period. She had trained him herself. Ji-hwan thought about that longer than he needed to. Then he got dressed and went to the office, because there are certain conversations that shouldn't happen over a phone. Zurielle was already there when he arrived at 8:15. This was not unusual. She was frequently at her desk before him, and he had stopped remarking on it years ago. What was unusual was that she was sitting very still, both hands flat on the surface of her desk, looking at nothing in particular, and she didn't look up when he came through the door, which she always did. He stopped in the doorway. "You already know," he said. She looked up then. "Sung-min called me at 7. I told him to wait until I spoke with you first." He made a judgment call. She said it without heat, but without excusing it either. Ellis Wardell. "Yes, I trained him." She said it the same way she'd have said a number that didn't add up, not with emotion exactly, but with the precision of someone identifying where the error entered the calculation. His first 3 months, calendar management, stakeholder communication protocols, executive floor procedures. I spent probably 40 hours with him in the first 6 weeks. Ji-hwan came fully into the room and sat down across from her desk, which he rarely did. He usually stood or remained in his own office doorway when they talked about operational matters. Sitting across from her felt different, more honest, maybe. He wasn't entirely sure why he did it. The access pattern, he said. How long? Sung's audit goes back 9 weeks. But the methodology looks older than that. The way the data was pulled suggests someone who'd been doing it long enough to know which access points weren't flagged in routine reviews. So longer, probably. She looked at her hands on the desk. He didn't know what he was feeding into. Sung-min is fairly confident. Ellis thought it was low corporate intelligence scheduled data, location check-ins, the kind of thing that gets sold between companies during competitive procurement. He was being paid. Not a lot. Enough. Ji-hwan said that doesn't make it less of a problem. No. It makes it a different kind of problem. She looked up. He was a tool. He didn't understand what the tool was being used for. You're defending him. I'm categorizing him accurately. She said it with a sharpness that wasn't directed at Ji-hwan exactly, but had to go somewhere. There's a difference. Vaughn knew. Vaughn had a specific grievance and made a deliberate choice. Ellis was 26 years old and thought he was selling scheduling data to a corporate competitor and getting paid $600 a month for it. He was selling your location to a man who was stalking you. Yes, and he'll face legal consequences for that, the same as Vaughn. She straightened slightly in her chair. But I'm not going to let you treat them as the same situation, because they're not. Ji-hwan looked at her for a moment. She was right, and he knew she was right. And he also knew that the distinction she was drawing required a level of precision that he found genuinely difficult to maintain when what he was actually feeling was something closer to a targeted, concentrated fury that needed somewhere to go. He kept it where it was. "What do you want to do with him?" he asked. Same procedure as Vaughn, HR legal documented termination. The data access violation gets referred to outside counsel. I want a paper trail that doesn't depend on anyone's testimony, just the access logs. And Corbin. Zurielle was quiet for a moment. Corbin is the source, she said. Vaughn and Ellis were infrastructure. Pulling the infrastructure doesn't stop the source. No, Ji-hwan agreed, it doesn't. The room was quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco was doing what it did on gray Saturday mornings, fog sitting low over the bay, the bridge cables disappearing into it at the midpoint, traffic on the streets below already thickening toward the mid-morning rush. He's going to escalate, Zurielle said. When the information stops coming, he's going to escalate. Ji-hwan said nothing, because she was correct, and they both knew it. I need you to be ready for that, she said. Not ready to intervene. Ready to hold still while I manage it. He looked at her. That's a hard thing to ask. I know what I'm asking. Zurielle Ji-hwan. She said his name the way she said most things cleanly without decoration. If you move on Corbin without my knowledge, or if your people make contact with him, or if anything happens to him that I didn't sanction, I will walk out of this building and not come back. I want you to understand that. I mean that literally. The word sat in the air between them. Ji-hwan understood, in the way that he understood most things that mattered, that she wasn't making a threat. She was defining the terms of her continued presence in a situation where her continued presence was, in fact, the only thing holding his worst instincts in place. I understand, he said. Do you? Yes. He said it without qualifying it, because she deserved that. Split scene. She looked at him for a moment longer, reading him the way she'd been reading him for 3 years, with the particular attention of someone who had learned to track the difference between what he said and what he meant. Whatever she found, she apparently decided it was sufficient, because she nodded once and reached for a folder on her desk. Then let's talk about the Ellis termination procedure, she said. Ellis Wardell was called into a meeting on Monday morning by Hanul Pacific's HR director. He walked into that meeting, believing it was a performance check-in. He walked out of it with a documented termination package, a no-contact agreement, and a referral letter informing him that the company's outside counsel had been retained in connection with an unauthorized data access review in which his credentials were material evidence. He was 26. He sat in that meeting room and went through 4 distinct phases: confusion, then the particular pale shock of someone understanding they've badly misjudged a situation, then a brief attempt at explaining that it wasn't what it looked like, then silence in approximately 11 minutes. Zurielle was not in the meeting. She had specifically requested not to be. She sat at her desk on the 31st floor and reviewed a property acquisition document and did not think about what was happening 3 floors below her, or she tried not to, which is a different thing entirely. Ji-hwan walked past her desk at 10:42 and said nothing. She said nothing back. At 11:15, the HR director sent a confirmation message that Ellis had vacated the building. Zurielle read the message, set her phone down, and returned to the acquisition document. She got through another paragraph before she stopped again, and just sat there for a moment with her hands in her lap. She had spent 40 hours training him. She'd answered his questions about the calendar system, walked him through the stakeholder protocol documents, told him which executives preferred phone calls over emails and which ones would ignore a voicemail for a week, but respond to a message within 10 minutes. She had at some point during those 6 weeks believed she was watching a capable young man learn something useful. And for 9 weeks, maybe more, he had been sending pieces of her life to a man who wanted to use them to find her. She pressed her palms flat against the desk. Then she picked up the acquisition document and kept reading. By Wednesday, the information flow to Corbin had been severed from both identified sources. By Thursday, Corbin appeared outside the building twice, once in the morning, once in the late afternoon. Both times in the rental vehicle. Both times parked across the intersection, far enough to claim coincidence if challenged. Both times on Sungmin's cameras. He wasn't getting new data. He was compensating by increasing proximity. Ji-hwan reviewed the camera footage on Thursday evening and felt something tighten in his chest that he recognized as the particular frustration of a man who had spent 20 years solving problems through direct intervention being forced to watch a problem develop at someone else's pace. He called Sungmin into his office. "What's his pattern?" Ji-hwan asked. "Morning arrival is between 7:40 and 8:10. The afternoon sit is between 5 and 6:30. He stays no more than 90 minutes. He doesn't get out of the vehicle. Does he know we're watching him? He knows the building has cameras. He doesn't know the street coverage extends as far as it does." Ji-hwan looked at the stilled footage frame on his tablet, the rental car, the intersection, the ordinary street. He's waiting to see her. That would be consistent with the pattern. Yes. He's not getting the schedule anymore, so he's reverting to visual surveillance. Yes, Ji-hwan set the tablet down. She knows about the Thursday sits? Ms. Baptiste reviewed the footage this afternoon. She said to document and forward to her attorney's office. He nodded. There was nothing else to say. He had agreed to the terms. The terms meant that this particular piece of information went to an attorney's filing system rather than to the two men Sungmin could have in position outside that intersection within 40 minutes. He thanked Sungmin and told him to keep monitoring. After Sungmin left, Ji-hwan sat in his office for a while in the dark. He was not by disposition a man given to extended self-examination. He had built something large and functional out of the habit of deciding quickly and not second-guessing the decision once it was made. But sitting in the dark in his office on the 31st of a man who had put bruises on his executive secretary's wrist and was now parking across the street to watch her building, he found himself doing something uncomfortably close to self-examination anyway. He had agreed to her terms because they were the right terms. He knew that. She had explained it with the clarity of someone who had thought it through carefully, and she was correct on every point that eliminating Corbin without due process created exposure, that the legal route built a record that incapacitation couldn't, and most importantly, that she deserved the right to determine how her own safety was managed. He knew all of that. He still sat in the dark for a while, longer than was strictly necessary. The message came Friday night at 9:48. Zurielle's at her apartment. Zurielle was the third apartment she'd rented since leaving Corbin. She'd moved twice in the 6 weeks since the breakup, each time believing the new address would create enough distance. She was reading when her phone lit up with an unknown number. She had stopped answering unknown numbers 3 weeks ago. She let this one go to voicemail. There was no voicemail. 20 seconds later, a text came through from the same number. It was a photograph. Zurielle Baptiste, Zurielle's younger sister, 29 years old, exiting the veterinary clinic where she worked as a technician. The photograph was timestamped that afternoon at 4:17. Nala was carrying a canvas bag and looking at her own phone, and she had no idea the picture was being taken. Because why would she? She was a veterinary technician leaving work on a Friday. A sound like scene wood splitting, not someone who had any reason to believe her sister's former boyfriend had positioned himself outside her workplace with a camera. Below the photograph, a single line of text, "She looks well. I hope she stays that way." Zurielle read the message twice. She did not panic. She had at some point in the past 6 weeks moved through panic and come out the other side into something harder and colder, and it was that harder, colder place she was operating from now. She screenshotted the message with the timestamp visible. She forwarded it to her attorney with a brief description of context. She called Nala, told her to go directly home, not to answer unknown numbers, not to be alarmed, but to treat the next few days as a period of elevated caution. Nala said, "What does elevated caution mean?" Zurielle said, "It means don't go anywhere alone after dark. Don't vary your route in ways that would take you somewhere isolated, and call me if anything feels off." Nala was quiet for a moment. "Is this still about Corbin?" "Yes." "Zuri, I'm handling it. I need you to follow the precautions and not push back on them tonight." Another pause. Then, "Okay." After she ended the call, Zurielle sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the photograph of her sister still open on her phone. Nala was 29 and had nothing to do with any of this. She worked with animals. She drove a sensible car and called their mother twice a week, and had never, in her entire life, done anything to Corbin Daker except exist in the same family as his former girlfriend. Zurielle looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she called Ji-hwan. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake. She forwarded him the screenshot without preamble and said, "He sent this tonight." She heard him look at it. The silence on his end was brief, but had a particular quality, the compression of someone pulling a very sharp response back behind their teeth. "Where is your sister now?" he asked. "Home. I called her already. She knows to be careful. I can have someone positioned outside her building by—" "No." Zurielle said it immediately. "No surveillance of Nala without her knowledge and explicit consent. She's not part of this operation. Zurielle, he's threatening her. I know what he's doing. He also knows my sister. If I send protection to her building without telling her, she'll find out, and she'll lose trust in my ability to manage this." And if she loses that trust, she starts making her own decisions about how to handle it. And that creates a different problem. Ji-hwan was quiet for a moment. So what do we do? I call Nala back in the morning and tell her exactly what's happening. I give her the option. If she wants someone positioned outside her building, she makes that choice herself, and we arrange it through a legitimate security firm, not your people. A legitimate security firm takes 48 hours to arrange properly. Then we start tonight. She paused. I'll handle the call to the firm. I have a contact, but I want your security team to share the camera footage of Corbin's vehicle with my attorney tonight. Timestamp, plate confirmation, the parking pattern from this week. The message about Nala goes into the same file. I want it all together. I'll have Sungmin send it within the hour. Thank you. There was a beat of silence on the line. Not uncomfortable, they'd been working together long enough that silence didn't need to be filled. Ji-hwan said, "You're not sleeping tonight." It wasn't a question. "Probably not much," she agreed. "You should eat something if you haven't." It was such an ordinary thing to say that for a moment she almost laughed, which was not what she'd expected to feel. "I'll manage. I know you will." A pause. "I'm here if the situation changes." "I know." She looked at the photograph on her phone one more time, then closed it. "Good night, Ji-hwan." "Good night." She set the phone down on the nightstand, got up, went to the kitchen, and made toast because he'd mentioned food, and now she was aware that she hadn't eaten since 2 in the afternoon. She stood at the counter and ate it, without tasting it, and thought about Corbin Dacre standing outside a veterinary clinic with a camera and what that meant about what he was willing to do now that the information pipeline had gone quiet. He was telling her the cost of resistance. She had heard it. She was not going to pay it. Saturday morning, Nala didn't react the way Zurielle had braced for. She expected tears or anger, or the particular kind of frightened helplessness that sometimes surfaces when someone realizes they've been made into a target without choosing it. What she got instead was 20 seconds of silence on the line, and then her sister's voice coming back flat and controlled in a way that reminded Zurielle, with a sharp and slightly painful clarity, of their mother. "So he went after me to get to you," Nala said. "Yes." "And you've been building a legal case this whole time." "Yes. And you didn't tell me because until last night you weren't part of his pattern. I didn't want to pull you into it before it was necessary." Another pause. "Do you need me to do anything?" Zurielle closed her eyes briefly. "The security firm will contact you today about exterior coverage for your building. Standard, professional, licensed. I'm paying for it. I don't need you to—" Nala, a beat. "Okay. And forward me anything unusual. Any number you don't recognize, any delivery you didn't order, any car that parks on your block more than once in a week." "Got it." A pause. "Zuri, are you actually okay?" Zurielle looked out her apartment window. Gray morning sky, the same fog that sat on the city every Saturday, her street below quiet and ordinary. "I'm not okay," she said. "But I'm functional, which is what the situation needs right now." Nala made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite argument. "Come for dinner Sunday," Zurielle said. "Somewhere public. We'll pick the place together." "Yeah," Nala said. "Okay." The compliance documentation was complete by Monday. Zurielle's attorney, a woman named Diane Rice, who had handled 3 prior harassment cases and had the particular unhurried precision of someone who had seen every variety of this situation and remained unimpressed by all of them, called Monday afternoon to confirm that the package was ready. "We have the access logs, the camera footage, the message chain, including last Friday's photograph, and the documented delivery, the flowers, and the key tag," Diane said. "We also have the plate confirmation tying the vehicle to Dacre's rental and the timestamp record of his stationary surveillance pattern." "Is it enough for a protective order?" Zurielle asked. "It's enough to apply. Whether the application is granted depends on the judge and the calendar. We're looking at an expedited hearing, given the escalating pattern and the threat to a third party, your sister." "How long?" "If I file tomorrow, we're looking at 5 to 7 business days for the hearing date, assuming the court schedule cooperates." 5 to 7 business days. Zurielle did the calculation against the trajectory of Corbin's behavior, the frequency increase, The Nala photograph. The loss of his 2 inside sources. 5 to 7 days was not a short window, given that window's contents. File tomorrow, she said. And Diane, I want it on record that I'm prepared to appear at the hearing in person. I'll note that. She ended the call and updated Ji-hwan on the timeline. He received it without comment, which she recognized as the sound of a man actively restraining himself from saying something about 5 to 7 business days that would not be useful. She appreciated the restraint. The second escalation came Tuesday evening. Zurielle was working late. She was frequently working late, and she had stopped apologizing for it when her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number she didn't recognize as any of the previous unknown numbers Corbin had used. He was rotating through new numbers. That was new. The message read, Pier 32, 10-0 tonight. Come alone. We end this. Below it, a second message arrived 40 seconds later. It was a photograph of Nala's car, parked outside Nala's apartment building, taken from close enough that the license plate was clearly readable. Zurielle stared at both messages for 11 seconds. She was aware of several things at once. The deliberate escalation of the threat, the careful framing we end this, as though this were a mutual situation with a mutual resolution, the specific targeting of Nala's car as a signal that he had followed her sister at some point in the last 24 hours, and the particular sensation in her chest that was not fear, exactly, but was the physical response to fear compressed into something denser and more controlled. She forwarded both messages to Diane immediately. Then she stood up from her desk, walked to Ji-hwan's office door, and knocked twice. He was still there. He was frequently still there when she worked late, which she had noticed without remarking on for approximately 2 years. He looked up from a document. She held up her phone so he could read the messages. She watched his face. She had seen Ji-hwan Baek's face in boardrooms, intense negotiations, during 2 separate federal inquiries in which the company's counsel had advised him to say nothing and he had said nothing, with the particular composure of a man who had rehearsed absence of expression until it became structure. She had learned to read the difference between the controlled surface and what moved underneath it. What moved underneath it right now was not something she had a precise word for. It was very quiet and very focused, and it was the furthest thing from cold. He lowered the phone. No, she said, before he said anything. He looked at her. Whatever you're thinking, she said. No. He's threatening your sister. I know that. He wants you at a waterfront pier at 10 o'clock at night. I know that too, Zurielle. This is exactly the moment he's been building toward, she said. She said it steadily, because she had been thinking through this the entire walk from her desk to his door. He's removed everything else. He can't get my schedule. The outside surveillance gives him an approximate pattern, but nothing precise. He can't get to me directly, so he's using Nala to force a meeting on his terms. Which is why you're not going. Which is why I'm going on my terms. She held his gaze. Not his. Mine. The room went very quiet. Ji-hwan set the document he'd been holding down on his desk. He did it carefully, the way she set things down on her desk when she needed a moment to organize herself before she said something that mattered. Explain what that means, he said. Diane files for the emergency protective order first thing tomorrow. I go to Pier 32 tonight with my phone recording, police notified in advance and positioned at distance. And your people, if you insist on positioning people, stationed far enough away that Corbin cannot see them and cannot claim that I arrived with backup. If something goes wrong, something has already gone wrong. It went wrong 6 weeks ago in an apartment when he grabbed my wrist and I decided I was done. This is the end of the sequence, Ji-hwan. Not the middle. She paused. He wants to talk me back into the situation. He's going to try to reframe everything he's done as concern and love and desperation, and he's going to wait for me to apologize or capitulate or at minimum soften enough that he thinks he has a path back in. And instead he gets to listen to me formally state that the relationship is over and that any further contact will have documented legal consequences. In front of a recording that can be used in a hearing. After his messages to Nala are already in Diane's filing, Ji-hwan looked at her for a long time. She stood in his office doorway and looked back at him and did not look away and did not soften it and did not give him any version of the expression that would make it easier for him to find a reason to override her. "You understand," he said finally, "that if he does anything on that pier." Then the recording captures it, the officers move in, and his case becomes significantly stronger against him. She paused. "I need you to understand something, not just agree with it, understand it. If you take over this situation because you've decided you know better than I do how to end it, then you've done the same thing he did. You've just done it more politely." The words landed. She saw them land. Ji-hwan looked at her for another moment. Then he said very quietly, "Tell me what you need from my team." She exhaled, not with relief, exactly, but with the particular release of a breath, held past the point of comfort. "Camera coverage of the pier approach," she said, "not on the pier itself. And someone with a direct line to the officers coordinating nearby. That's all. All right?" And Ji-hwan. She waited until he looked at her directly. "You stay back. Not a block back. Far enough that if Corbin sees you, it registers as coincidence." He nodded once. She went back to her desk, called Diane, and began building the structure of what would happen at 10 o'clock. On Pier 32 methodically, precisely, with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 6 weeks being afraid in rooms she'd tried to make safe and was finished. The fog was already moving in off the bay. She could feel it even through the sealed windows of the 31st floor, the way the air pressure shifted when the marine layer came in thick, a particular kind of cold that San Francisco saved for its most consequential nights. She kept working. Diane Reese filed the emergency protective order application at 7:53 Tuesday morning. Zurielle knew because Diane sent a confirmation text at 7:54, and Zurielle was already at her desk, with coffee she hadn't touched yet, watching the timestamp appear on her phone screen with the particular attention of someone tracking a process they cannot afford to have fail. The filing was clean. Everything was in it: the access logs, the camera footage, the message chain, the Nala photograph, the key tag from the flowers, the rotating phone numbers, the documented parking pattern outside Hanul Pacific headquarters across 6 consecutive business days. Diane had organized it the way she organized everything, without drama, without editorializing, in the precise sequential language that judges responded to better than emotional testimony. It was a strong filing. Diane had told her so the night before, and Diane was not a woman who offered reassurance she didn't mean. Zurielle set her phone down and picked up her coffee and looked out at the morning fog over the bay and thought about 10 o'clock. 11 hours and change. She spent the morning working. This was not avoidance, or it was avoidance, but the functional kind, the kind that keeps your hands moving and your mind from collapsing inward on a single point. She processed 3 vendor contracts, responded to 14 emails, prepared briefing notes for a board subcommittee meeting scheduled for Thursday, and coordinated a property inspection report that had been sitting in her queue for 2 weeks. Ji-hwan came through the suite at 10:15, looked at her, didn't say anything, and went into his office. At 11, he came back out and set a paper bag on the corner of her desk. She looked at it. "Lunch," he said, "from the place on Kearney. It's 11 o'clock. Early lunch." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular expression he wore when he had decided something and was waiting to see if she was going to argue with it, which was different from his general, resting expression mostly in the stillness of it. She opened the bag, soup. The kind with the soft tofu that she'd mentioned once, 8 months ago, offhandedly, as something she'd eaten growing up. She hadn't mentioned it since. She wasn't sure she'd thought about it since. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back into his office. She ate the soup at her desk and kept working, and did not think about the fact that he had remembered something she'd said once 8 months ago, or what it meant that he had, because there was no useful place for that thought to go today of all days. At 2 in the afternoon, Sung-min called her directly. This was unusual. Sung-min operated through Ji-hwan's channels as a rule, and the fact that he was calling her personal line directly meant Ji-hwan had authorized it, which meant the information was something Ji-hwan had decided she should receive without the filter of him deciding how to frame it first. She appreciated that more than she'd expected to. "Miss Baptiste," Sungmin said. He had a careful, even voice that carried information the way good structure carries weight efficiently, without ornamentation. We've identified a third access point. She set her pen down. Camera coverage on the pier approach you requested. Last night, we ran a preliminary check this afternoon to confirm placement and sight lines. In the course of that check, my team identified a relay device installed in a junction box on the east side of the building's exterior network panel. It's a passive interceptor. It's been pulling scheduling data from the building's internal calendar system and transmitting it to an external receiver. Zurielle said nothing for 3 seconds. How long, she said. Based on the device's storage capacity and the data we're recovering from it, minimum 4 months. Possibly closer to 6. Before Vaughn, she said. Before Vaughn, yes. Vaughn's credential access was layered on top of a data stream that was already flowing. He may not have known the device existed. And Ellis? Also likely unaware. Ellis was selling scheduling information he pulled manually. The device was pulling the same information automatically, in parallel. 2 separate pipelines. Zurielle was quiet. The implication settled into place with the particular precision of something that, once understood, reorganizes everything around it. Vaughn had given Corbin access to her calendar. Ellis had sold him scheduling data. But underneath both of those older than both of them, running continuously for months before them, someone had installed a hardware device directly into the building's external network infrastructure. That was not the work of an angry operations manager with a grievance, or a junior coordinator looking for extra money. That required physical access to the building's exterior network panel. It required technical knowledge specific enough to install an intercept device without triggering the system's existing monitoring. A sound like required either someone who worked in facilities or building maintenance, or someone who had access to that level of the building's physical infrastructure on a basis that wouldn't be questioned. Who has access to that panel? She said. We're compiling that list now. Building maintenance staff, the contracted network services company, the 2 IT infrastructure managers on the technical operations team, and any executive who has authorization to approve external contractor access. How many people total? Preliminary count is between 22 and 31, depending on how far back we extend the access authorization records. 22 to 31 people. Sungmin, she said carefully. The device, is it still active? As of this afternoon, yes. We've isolated it from the live data stream as of approximately 40 minutes ago, but we haven't removed it, because removing it would alert whoever monitors the receiver that the pipeline has been discovered. So they don't know we found it yet. Correct. She thought about that for a moment. Leave it in place. Don't remove it. Keep the isolation, but leave the physical device where it is. I'll confirm with Mr. Baek. Yes, tell him I'm requesting that specifically. She paused. And Sungmin the peer tonight. Does this change your coverage assessment? A brief pause on his end. It changes the threat assessment. If Dacre has had a continuous data feed for 6 months, his knowledge of your patterns is significantly more detailed than we previously calculated. Right. She looked out the window. Right, Ms. Baptiste. The meeting tonight is still happening. She said it before he could finish the sentence. On my terms, nothing changes. Another pause. Understood. She ended the call and sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up, walked to Ji-hwan's office doorway, and knocked twice on the open door, even though he had already looked up. I need you to clear your afternoon, she said. They sat from each other in his office, her in the chair across his desk, him behind it, which was the opposite configuration from Saturday morning, and she thought briefly that there was something in the geometry of it that was different. More formal, less like 2 people who had been working beside each other for 3 years, and more like 2 people who needed the width of a desk between them to have the conversation they were about to have without it becoming something else. She told him everything Sungmin had told her. She told it sequentially, without editorializing. The way she'd learned to present complicated information to difficult people, give them the structure first, and let them reach for the implications themselves, rather than leading them to conclusions that might feel like ambush. Ji-hwan listened without speaking. When she finished, He was quiet for a moment. 6 months, he said. Minimum. Before Vaughn. Yes. He looked past her for a moment toward the window, at nothing in particular. She had seen him look at nothing in particular before, in meetings when he was processing something, and she had learned that the absence of expression during those moments was not blankness, but the exact opposite of it. The device required physical placement, he said. Yes, which means someone with building access. Not an employee necessarily contracted access is also on the list. Sung Min's compiling it, 22 to 31 names. That's a large number to run quickly. I know. He looked at her. Zurielle. Tonight, still happening. With an unidentified third source who may still be active. With an unidentified third source who no longer has access to live data because Sung Min isolated the feed 40 minutes ago. She held his gaze. Corbin set tonight's meeting before the device was isolated. He's going to the pier on the information he already has. What he doesn't know is that what he thinks he knows about my patterns and resources is now incomplete. That cuts both ways. Yes, it means he might be more desperate than we've calculated, because the certainty he's been operating on is about to evaporate. She paused. Which is actually better for tonight. Desperate people are less controlled. Less controlled means the recording captures more. Ji-hwan looked at her for a long time. You've already thought through the worst version of tonight, he said. It was not a question. Multiple times. And you're still going. Yes. He looked at her with something that she couldn't entirely categorize. It wasn't the frustrated restraint she'd seen from him before, or the particular stillness of a man controlling his instinct to act. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. All right, he said. Tell me what the coverage looks like. She walked him through it. He listened, asked 2 questions, both logistical, both precise, neither of them an attempt to add resources she hadn't sanctioned, and when she finished, he nodded once. I'll position myself 3 blocks north, he said. I'll have Sung Min on a direct line. Not closer. 3 blocks north, Zurielle. I heard you. She nodded. Then she stood up to go back to her desk. One more thing, he said. She stopped. The third source, whoever installed the device. They know about tonight. She turned to look at him. Not necessarily, she said carefully. They have 6 months of your scheduling data. They know your patterns, your contacts, your standard procedures for late evenings. If they've been feeding information to Dacre with enough detail for him to stage a meeting at a specific pier at a specific time, then they may have helped him design it. She finished the sentence, because not finishing, it was a kind of avoidance she couldn't afford. Yes, I've considered that. And it means I go into tonight knowing the playing field might be more prepared than I can fully account for. She held his gaze. It doesn't change the calculus. It changes the stakes. Ji-hwan said nothing. If I don't go, she said, he escalates against Nala. The legal timeline is 5 to 7 business days minimum. He's already told me what happens in that window if I don't meet him. She paused. I'm going. He looked at her for one more moment. Then, be careful. Always, she said, and went back to her desk. At 6 o'clock, she left the building through the main entrance. This was deliberate. Corbin, if he was running his afternoon surveillance, would see her leave at approximately her normal time. She wanted him to see that. She wanted him to believe the evening was proceeding on schedule, that she was going home, that 10 o'clock was still a separate decision she hadn't made yet. She took the car service to her apartment, changed into flat shoes and a dark jacket, forwarded Diane the evening structure one more time, and called Nala at 7:30 to confirm that the security firm's exterior coverage was in place. Nala confirmed it. Then she said, "Call me when it's over." "I will, Zuri." A pause. "You don't have to be this strong all the time." Zurielle sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her shoes. "I know, you never sound scared." "I am scared," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said out loud in 6 weeks, and she said it quietly, without ceremony, because her sister deserved the truth of it, even if no one else did. "I'm scared most of the time. I just can't afford to let it drive." Nala was quiet for a moment. "Come home after," she said. "Not your apartment, Mom's. Just sleep somewhere that isn't alone." "Maybe," Zurielle said. She ended the call, stood up, and put her phone in her jacket pocket with the recording function already running. The fog came in hard off the bay by 9 o'clock. By 9:30, when Zurielle arrived at the waterfront and walked the approach to Pier 32, the visibility had dropped to the point where the far end of the pier disappeared into gray-white, nothing approximately 60 yards out. The dock lights were on, but they didn't do much against fog. This thick, they created visibility for maybe 20 feet around each fixture and left everything between them in graduated dark. She walked the approach once, slowly, getting the geography. The pier was a working dock older structure, concrete and weathered timber, splitting, the kind that had been functional before the waterfront redevelopment and stayed functional after it, because certain commercial operations needed piers that weren't optimized for tourism. There were storage containers on the near end, a service building with a padlocked door, coiled line, and equipment crates stacked against the railing. She identified 3 positions where someone could stand and not be immediately visible from the entrance. She noted them and kept walking. At 9:52, she was standing near the midpoint of the pier. Behind her, the city. In front of her, the fog and the dark water underneath it. Her phone was in her left jacket pocket, recording. Her right hand was free. She could hear the water against the pilings below. She waited. He came at 10:04. She heard him before she saw him footsteps on the concrete approach, unhurried, the pace of someone who believed they had controlled every variable. She turned when he was about 30 feet out, which gave her time to see him clearly before he reached her. Corbin Dacre was 37 and looked exactly like what he was not threatening on the surface, which was the whole problem. Medium height, the kind of unremarkable physical presence that didn't register in anyone's memory until it was standing in front of them again. He was wearing a jacket she recognized from when they were together, dark blue, which she suspected was intentional. He walked up to approximately 10 feet away and stopped. "You came," he said. "I'm here," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she remembered from the early months of their relationship, attentive, warm, the face he wore when he was performing emotional availability. She had once found it reassuring. Now she recognized the effort behind it the way you recognized effort in something you'd once believed was natural. "I wasn't sure you would," he said. "You made it difficult to decline." Something moved across his face at that, not quite discomfort, more like a recalibration. "The picture of Nala, I want you to understand that. I didn't mean it as a threat, Corbin. I'm serious. I was trying to communicate that I still care about both of you. That this whole thing has been about—" "Stop," she said it quietly, without heat. "I'm not going to debate what you meant. I'm here because you asked me to come, and because I have things to say to you that I wanted to say directly." She looked at him steadily. Once. He looked back at her. The warmth in his face had shifted slightly, the way it used to shift when he realized a conversation wasn't going the direction he'd planned. "You've been following me since I left," she said. "You've had people inside my workplace pulling my schedule and location. You sent flowers with my old key tag in them. You photographed my sister. You've called me from rotating numbers at night. You've parked outside my building and watched it." She kept her voice level. "I'm naming all of it because I want you to understand that I know exactly what has happened in sequence, and I want it on record that I've said it to you directly." Corbin stared at her. "Zurielle, I'm not finished." She held his gaze. "The relationship is over. It was over when I walked out 6 weeks ago. It was over before that. I'm telling you now, in a way that can be clearly understood, that you are not to contact me, contact Nala, contact my workplace, or contact anyone connected to me in any form, through any intermediary, for any reason." The warmth in his face was entirely gone now. "You're doing this because of him," Corbin said. "Because of your boss. This has nothing to do with Ji-hwan. Don't." His voice tightened. "Don't tell me this is your decision. I know what he's been doing. I know he's had people watching me. I know he's been— This is my decision," she said it without raising her voice, without any variation in tone. "Every part of what has happened in the past 6 weeks has been my decision. The documentation, the attorneys, this conversation. Mine. He looked at her, and she saw something happening behind his eyes, that she recognized the particular realignment that happened when he couldn't frame a situation as something she'd been manipulated into, when the only remaining explanation was that she actually meant what she was saying. He never handled that well. "You owe me an explanation," he said. "After everything, I don't owe you anything." 3 years, Zurielle? "I don't owe you anything," she said again, the same tone, the same level. "That's the part you've never been able to accept. The relationship ending doesn't create a debt. Leaving doesn't require your permission. And the fact that you refuse to accept that doesn't make it less true." Corbin stared at her. She watched him work through something, watched the performance of calm reassemble and then break apart at the edges. "Picture of Nala," he said slowly. "You think that was a threat?" "Yes. And your boss, Ji-hwan." She said his name deliberately. "His name is Ji-hwan, and he's 3 blocks away because I asked him to be, which is the difference between how he operates and how you do." Something shifted in Corbin's face. It was not the shift she expected. He looked at her with something she didn't have a clean word for, not anger exactly, not desperation. Something more deliberate than either of those things. Kind of settling into position that her body recognized before her mind had finished identifying it. 3 blocks, he said. "Yes. You sure about that?" She felt it then, the particular sensation that isn't quite sound and isn't quite physical, but is the registering the presence of someone it didn't know was there. Behind her, she turned. 2 men she had never seen before were standing between her and the pier entrance. They were not police officers. They were not Ji-hwan's security team. They were standing far enough back to be deemable, but close enough to communicate exactly what they were communicating, that the geometry of this conversation had been arranged before she arrived, and not by her. She looked back at Corbin. He had not moved. "I've been doing this wrong," he said. "Watching you, following you, waiting for you to come back on your own." He said it with the particular exhaustion of someone who has genuinely reconsidered their approach and arrived at a worse one. "That was wrong. I see that." Corbin, but he gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the pier, at the fog. "This is the conversation. This is the one I needed. No lawyers, no building security, no Korean mafia boss making decisions about your life while you think you're making them yourself." She looked at the 2 men behind her. She looked at the recording device in her pocket, which was still running. She looked at the 60 yards of fog between her and the pier entrance and the water below the railings on either side. She kept her voice entirely steady. "You planned this," she said. "I planned a conversation," he said. "That's all this is. A conversation you're not going to walk away from in 4 minutes because a lawyer told you to." "There are police officers positioned near this pier," she said. "Positioned where you told them," Corbin said. "I know where you told them." He watched her absorb that. "I told you, Zurielle. I know your patterns. I know your procedures. I know how you plan things." He paused. "The device in the network panel. You found it. You isolated it. I know that, too. I found out 20 minutes ago. The 3rd source. Still active. Not the device itself, the person who had installed it." Kept her face completely still. "The person who put it there," she said. "Doesn't matter who. It matters to me. It matters to you because you want to know if you can use it," Corbin said. "That's how you think. Everything is documentation and sequence and legal consequence." He took a step toward her, not aggressive, careful, the step of someone who has decided that physical proximity is its own argument. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to have a real conversation. One where your attorney isn't listening and your boss isn't 3 blocks away, and the recording in your pocket isn't building a case." She did not step back. "You know about the recording," she said. "I know about everything." He stopped about 6 feet away. "That's what you've never been able to accept. I know you, Zurielle. Better than your lawyers do. Better than your sister does. Better than he does. And I know that the version of you that's been managing this situation for 6 weeks is exhausted. I know that. I can see it." She looked at him. He was right about the exhaustion. He was right that she carried it. He was wrong about everything the exhaustion meant. "You brought 2 men to block the entrance to this pier," she said. "You have an inside source who told you about the device and about the police positioning. You researched my plans for tonight. You thought through the sight lines and the fog coverage and the fact that the dock lighting doesn't extend to the entrance. She looked at him without blinking. And you think I'm going to believe this was about a conversation? Something moved through Corbin's face. Zurielle, you told me once, she said, when we were together, that you just wanted to keep me safe. That everything you did was because you were afraid of losing me. She paused. I believed that. For a long time, I believed that you were afraid. I spent a lot of energy trying to reassure someone who was afraid. And then you grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises that lasted 3 weeks, she said. And I realized that what I'd been calling fear was actually something else. It was just control that hadn't shown its final form yet. Corbin stared at her. The men behind me, she said. Tell them to move. Zurielle, tell them to move, she said, or I stop speaking to you entirely and wait for the recording to do the work. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a small gesture with his right hand. The 2 men shifted not away from the entrance entirely, but far enough to one side that the path was nominally open. She did not move toward it. Not yet. Because in that moment, standing in the fog on Pier 32 with her phone recording in her jacket pocket and 2 men 20 feet behind her, and a man she had spent 3 years of her life with standing 6 feet away, something clarified that had been building for 6 weeks without fully forming. She had come tonight with a plan. The plan was good. The plan was hers, and it was thorough, and it was built on the assumption that if she controlled the structure of the meeting, the outcome was manageable. Corbin had known the plan. Not because he was smarter than she was, or because her systems had failed. They had found Vaughn, they had found Ellis, they had found the device. Her systems had not failed. But the third source, the person inside the building's infrastructure, the person who had known about the isolation within minutes, the person who had fed Corbin the police positioning tonight, was still unidentified. Still inside, still active. And that person had built tonight's trap around her plan. She looked at Corbin. He looked back at her with something that was almost satisfaction, but not quite the expression of someone waiting for the moment when the other person stops pretending they have more options than they do. Behind her, the water moved against the pilings. Above her, the fog sat on the pier lights and didn't move. And Zurielle Baptiste, who had survived 6 weeks of managed fear with precision and documentation, and the refusal to let terror make her decisions, stood at the center of a situation that her best planning had not been able to fully account for. And understood with complete clarity that the only way through it now required something different than everything she had been doing. Not because her approach was wrong, because the ground had shifted underneath it in a way she hadn't seen coming, and standing still on ground that had shifted was its own kind of surrender. She looked at Corbin, and at the 2 men behind her, and at the 60 yards of fog between her position and the pier entrance, and she made a decision about what happened next. She called Ji-hwan, not Diane, not the police coordinator. Ji-hwan, because the police coordinator needed instructions, and Diane needed context, and Ji-hwan needed 1 sentence. She pulled the phone from her pocket, the recording still running. She did not stop it, and hit his name and put it to her ear, and said, when he answered on the first ring, the positioning tonight was compromised. Third source is still active. I need you to move. She heard him exhale once, sharp and controlled. How far in are you? Midpoint of the pier. 2 men at the entrance. Corbin 6 feet in front of me. Are you hurt? No. I'm moving. She ended the call and put the phone back in her jacket pocket with the recording running and looked at Corbin, who had watched the entire call with an expression that had shifted from something close to satisfaction into something she didn't have a clean word for yet. That was a mistake, he said, calling for backup. Calling him. He said the word with a particular weight, and she understood that whatever Corbin had built in his mind about Ji-hwan and what Ji-hwan represented in the architecture of his obsession was something large and structural and not entirely rational. You just handed him exactly what he's been waiting for. This isn't about him, she said. Everything you've done in the last 6 weeks has been about him. Corbin, she kept her voice level. I'm going to walk off this pier. You can let that happen, or you can make choices that are going to compound everything that's already documented against you. But I'm walking off this pier. He looked at her. She looked back. She took 1 step toward the entrance. The larger of the two men at the entrance moved when she was 15 feet out. He didn't touch her. He moved laterally into her path, the way a door closes, not aggressive, not grabbing, just occupying space in a way that communicated that the space was no longer available. He was 6'2", broad across the shoulders, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had blocked exits before. She stopped. She was aware of her own breathing, measured, deliberate, the breathing she'd been practicing for 6 weeks every time the fear got close enough to affect her respiration. She was aware of the water underneath the pier, the fog pressing down on the dock lights, the sound of the city somewhere beyond the entrance that felt very far away. She was aware that she was afraid. She was also aware that she had been afraid every day for 6 and had done everything necessary anyway, and that tonight was not going to be the exception. She looked at the man in front of her. "Move," she said. He didn't. She reached into her jacket pocket, not for the phone she left that running, but for nothing. Because there was nothing else in there, and the reaching was not about producing an object. It was about producing a response. He tracked the hand movement with his eyes, which was what she needed him to do, because while his attention was on her right hand, she took 2 quick steps to the left, toward the pier railing and the gap between the storage containers and the railing edge, a gap narrow enough that it wasn't a route exactly, but wide enough that a person moving quickly could use it. She moved quickly. The man reached for her arm and missed by 4 inches, caught the edge of her jacket instead, and she twisted into the pull rather than against it, which is a thing you don't know to do until you've had to learn it, and she had had to learn it. And the jacket shoulder seam held for exactly 1 second before he released it rather than drag her sideways into the railing. She was past him. She was not at the entrance, yet there was still 30 feet between her and the open air of the waterfront, but she was past the static block and moving changed the arithmetic. Then Corbin said, "Stop." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not the warmth, not the careful performed concern, not even the frustrated rigidity she'd seen on the pier tonight. This was something underneath all of that, something that had been waiting below the surface of the version of Corbin she'd been managing. She stopped. Not because she was afraid of the word, because the tone told at something seconds that changed the last 15 seconds, and she needed the half-second of information that stopping would give her. She turned around. Corbin was closer than she'd realized. He'd moved while her attention was on the man at the entrance, and he was now 12 feet away, and he was holding her phone. Her jacket pocket had been open when the man grabbed the shoulder. She looked at the phone in his hand. The screen was still lit. The recording was still running, or it had been, because Corbin looked at the screen, found the recording application, and stopped it. Then he looked at her. "No more recording," he said. She looked at the phone. She looked at him. She ran the calculation. In the approximately 2 seconds she had to run it, the recording was gone, or the last 40 seconds of it were gone. But everything before that call to Ji-hwan was still captured. The 2 men at the entrance. His admission that he knew about the police positioning. The device in the panel. All of it was in the earlier recording, which had been uploading to a cloud backup automatically since she'd started it at her apartment. She knew that. He didn't know she knew that. She let him see her look at the phone with something that read as defeat, because letting him believe he'd won the recording was worth more right now than correcting his understanding. "All right," she said. He held the phone loosely at his side. Not pocketing it, holding it, the way someone holds something they've taken from you, to remind you they have it. "Come back to the middle of the pier," he said. "Finish the conversation." Zurielle. He said her name with the particular weight of someone who has decided that patience is a finite resource and his has run out. "Walk back to the middle of the pier and finish what we started. That's what you came here for." She looked at him. She walked back to the middle of the pier. Ji-hwan was moving at a pace that was not a run, but was the closest thing to it that didn't announce itself. Sung-min was on his left, 2 steps behind, and behind Sung-min were 2 more men who had been positioned 3 blocks north as instructed and were now repositioning because the instructions had changed. Ji-hwan had 4 men within a quarter mile of the pier, The police coordinator had been called Dongmin's second operator simultaneously with Zurielle's call to Ji-hwan, and the recalculation of the positioning was already happening. None of that was fast enough. Ji-hwan knew it wasn't fast enough because he knew the geometry of Pier 32. He'd studied it the previous afternoon, which Zurielle hadn't asked him to do, but which he'd done because studying a space before someone he was responsible for walked into it alone at night was not the kind of step he was capable of skipping. The pier was 400 feet of working dock. The entrance was narrow. The sight lines from the midpoint to were long enough so that anyone at the midpoint would see some approach in plenty of time. Plenty of time for what was the question he didn't have a clean answer to. He moved faster. In the middle of the pier, Corbin was talking. This was, Zurielle understood, what the entire evening had been constructed for. Not a confrontation, not a threat, a conversation that he got to conduct on terms he controlled, without the structure she'd built, around every other interaction, without documentation running, without his lawyers and filing systems, and the professional architecture she'd used to manage the distance between herself and the reality of what had been happening. He wanted the version of her that existed before all of that. He was not going to get it. But she needed him to believe he might, for approximately 8 more minutes, because 8 minutes was what Hot Green had her he needed when she'd called, and she was going to give him 8 minutes. "I'm not angry at you," Corbin said. He was standing 8 feet away from her now, which was close enough to be intimate and far enough to be deniable, and he had positioned himself so that her back was to the water, and his was to the entrance, which was deliberate. "I want you to understand that. Every decision I've made in the last 6 weeks has been because I needed to reach you. Because the system you built to keep me away was so complete that there was no legitimate way through it." She looked at him. "So you built an illegitimate one." "I built what I could build." He said it without apology, without shame, with the particular matter-of-fact tone of someone who has located themselves on the right side of their own narrative. "You disappeared. You documented everything. You turned your workplace into a fortress. What was I supposed to do?" "Accept it," she said. He looked at her. "Accept that I left," she said. "Accept that leaving was my choice, and the choice was final. That's what you were supposed to do." "You were in pain," he said. "You were running from something that scared you, and instead of my—" "Don't," she said it quietly, but with a precision that cut through whatever he was about to build. "Don't make my decision about my emotional state. I wasn't running from something that scared me. I was leaving something that hurt me. I hurt you." She looked at him. The admission surprised her not because she hadn't known it was true, but because she hadn't expected him to say it directly, without the architecture of justification around it. "Yes," she said, "I know that." He moved 1 step closer, which put him at 7 feet, and she held her position. "I know that, Zurielle. That's why I'm here. That's why I've been doing this for 6 weeks that have been—" He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, a gesture she recognized from arguments in their apartment, the gesture he made when he was performing the effort of composure. "I can't fix it from where I'm standing. You built a wall and I don't have a door. So I found a window." "You found a window that involved threatening my sister," she said. "That wasn't. Stop reframing it." She kept her voice completely even. "You sent a photograph of Nala's car to tell me that you could reach her. That's a threat. The language around it doesn't change what it was." He was quiet for a moment. 7 feet. She counted her own heartbeat. Steady. Not calm, she was not calm. She was operating at the precise edge of calm but steady. "What would you have done?" he said. "If I'd called your lawyer, she'd have documented the call and stopped it. If I'd gone to your building, your security team, your police contacts, every legitimate avenue you closed." "Yes," she said. "I closed them because you weren't entitled to access me." "I love you," he said. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, until the rehearsal becomes the feeling with total conviction. Because conviction is what practice produces. She looked at him. "I know you believe that," she said. "It's not, I know you believe it," she said again. "And I spent a year believing it too. And then I spent another year understanding that what you believe about your own feelings doesn't determine what those feelings produce in the people around you." She held his gaze. You love me, and you grabbed my wrist. You love me, and you put 2 men at the entrance to this pier. You love me, and you've spent 6 weeks finding ways to tell me that the consequences of leaving aren't private. She paused. I hear you, and none of it changes anything. Corbin's face did something complicated. She watched it, the performance of warmth giving way underneath to something rawer and less managed, the careful presentation of a reasonable man making a desperate appeal, cracking at the load-bearing points. What does he give you? Corbin said, and his voice had changed. That I didn't. She almost said Ji-hwan's name again, but she didn't. He lets me decide things, she said simply. The crack in Corbin's presentation widened. Ji-hwan came through the pier entrance at a controlled pace with Sung-min 1 step behind and the 2 officers who had repositioned on his right flank, all 4 of them moving without urgency, because urgency on a working dock at 10:18 at night carries differently than purpose, and purpose was what he was presenting. The man at the entrance, the one who had let Zurielle past, the one who had grabbed her jacket, turned when Ji-hwan was 12 feet out and put 1 hand up in the universal language of stop. Ji-hwan did not stop. He looked at the man with the particular expression that people who had worked for Ji-hwan for more than 6 months knew meant that whatever was about to happen had already been decided, and the only variable remaining was how much the other person understood that, and he walked through the hand gesture the way you walk through weather, acknowledging its presence without yielding to it. The man made a decision in about 2 seconds, which was that the Korean man walking toward him with that expression and 3 other people behind him was not someone whose momentum he was going to reverse with 1 outstretched hand, and he stepped aside. Ji-hwan kept moving. He could see Zurielle at the midpoint of the pier, her dark jacket, her posture, the particular way she stood that he recognized from 3 years of watching her stand in difficult rooms. Upright, shoulders set. Not aggressive, but completely uncompromising. The posture of a woman who had decided that retreat was not a structural option. He could see Corbin 8 feet in front of her. He covered the distance between the entrance and the midpoint in approximately 90 seconds. And in those 90 seconds, he did not break into a run, because running would signal emergency, and emergency on a pier with a man already cornered would accelerate things in directions he could control. And he had promised Zurielle specifically, precisely because she had required it, that he would not take over the situation. He was here because the positioning had been compromised. He was here because she'd called him and asked him to move. He was not here to end it. He came to a stop 15 feet behind Corbin. Corbin heard him or heard Sung-min or heard footsteps on the concrete dock and turned. When Corbin saw Ji-hwan, something moved through his face that was not surprise. It was something closer to a foregone conclusion, arriving on schedule. There he is, Corbin said. He said it to Zurielle, not to Ji-hwan, which told Ji-hwan something useful about where Corbin's focus lived. Right on time. Zurielle looked at Ji-hwan. Her expression said, I have this. Stay back. He stayed back. Corbin turned back to her. You see? He follows you. He positions his people around your life. He moves when you call him. And you think that's different from what I did? Yes, she said. How? Because I asked him to, she said. And when I told him not to, he didn't. Corbin stared at her. Ji-hwan stayed 15 feet back and kept his hands loose at his sides and looked at the second man, the one he hadn't seen from the entrance. The one positioned near the storage containers on the port side of the pier, and made no movement toward him. He let Sung-min register the second man's position and relay it to the officers. He kept his eyes on Zurielle and waited. This is over, Corbin said. He turned to face Ji-hwan now, which was a mistake, because it meant his back was to Zurielle, and Zurielle was where the conversation lived. Whatever you think you're doing here, I'm standing here, Ji-hwan said. His voice was even, not loud, not theatrical, just even, the way structural things are even. That's what I'm doing. You're here because she called you. Yes. Which means she doesn't actually have control of this situation. Which means everything she's been telling me about handling this herself is exactly what she said it was, Ji-hwan said. He looked at Corbin with a stillness that people who knew him understood as the most dangerous version of his attention. She called me because the conditions changed. She determined the conditions had changed, and she made a call. That's her decision. Same as everything else that's happened tonight. Corbin looked at him. Ji-hwan looked back. You think you're protecting her, Corbin said. I think she asked me to be here, Ji-hwan said. That's as far as my thinking goes on the subject. Behind Corbin, Zurielle took 3 steps forward, and when Corbin heard her movement and turned back to face her, she was 6 feet away from him instead of 8, and she was holding her hand out, palm up. My phone, she said. Corbin looked at her. My phone, she said again. You took it. Give it back. He looked at the phone in his hand, then at her outstretched hand, then at Ji-hwan, then back at her. The second man near the containers had gone very still, in the way people go still when they're calculating whether the moment they've been assigned to enforce is actually arriving. Zurielle kept her hand out. The fog moved overhead. The water hit the pilings below. Somewhere beyond the pier entrance, a car passed on the waterfront road. Corbin put the phone in her hand. She took it without closing her fingers around it, dramatically, without any performance of the moment. She just took it and slid it into her jacket pocket and looked at him. I'm going to walk off this pier, she said. You're not going to follow me. You're not going to follow me tonight, or tomorrow, or any night after that. You're not going to contact Nala. You're not going to contact my workplace. You're not going to contact anyone in my life through any channel, directly or through someone else. Corbin's jaw was tight. The recording I started at my apartment tonight has been uploading continuously to a cloud backup, she said. The copy you stopped was 1 copy. The backup is already at my attorney's office. Everything you said tonight, on this pier, about the police positioning, about the device, about the men you brought here, it's already in the file. She watched him understand that. The process of understanding it moved across his face, in layers, first the specific information, then the implication, then the full architectural understanding of what it meant that she had known this and not told him, that she had let him believe he'd won the recording and kept talking, that the entire conversation on the pier had been building a case while he'd been under the impression he'd neutralized the recording. He stopped. Yes, she said. He looked at Ji-hwan. He looked at Sung Min. He looked at the 2 officers who had come to stand at the edge of the pier's ambient light, visible now, positioned and present. He looked back at Zurielle. This isn't over, he said. He said it quietly, without heat, the way people say things they're trying to believe. It is, she said. It was over 6 weeks ago. Tonight just made sure the record reflected that. She turned and walked toward the pier entrance. Ji-hwan fell into step beside her, not in front of her, not behind her. Beside her at the pace she set, which was even and deliberate, and did not once break into something that could be read as flight. Toward Corbin, the second man near the containers had made his calculation and decided that whatever he'd been paid for tonight did not extend to the specific situation currently developing. A sound like green wood splitting, and he was already moving toward the railing on the far side of the pier in the direction of the service ladder. Sung Min noted it and made a call. At the entrance, Zurielle and Ji-hwan stepped off the dock and onto the open waterfront, and the fog closed behind them over the pier like a curtain coming down. She stopped walking when they were 30 feet from the entrance. He stopped beside her. She looked straight ahead at the city lights softened by fog, at the traffic on the waterfront road, at the ordinary San Francisco night that had continued being ordinary while the pier happened. The cloud backup, Ji-hwan said, has been running since I started the recording at my apartment, she said. Continuous upload. He was quiet for a moment. You knew when he stopped the local recording that the backup was already there, he said. Yes. And you let him believe he'd neutralized it. Yes. Another pause, he said carefully, extremely well constructed. I've been building it for 6 weeks, she said. She didn't say it with pride exactly. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who has spent a long time working very hard on something and is now standing on the other side of it and hasn't processed the distance yet. Her hands were not shaking. She checked. She looked down at them in the fog-softened light, and they were not shaking, which surprised her slightly because her chest was doing something complicated that she didn't have a word for. Ji-hwan looked at her hands. He didn't say anything about them. He looked back at the pier entrance. where the officers were visible now, where Sung Min was on a call, coordinating the second man's position, where the shape of what had happened on that dock was becoming the shape of official record. The third source, Zurielle said. Whoever fed Corbin the police positioning tonight. Sung Min has a short list, Ji-hwan said, based on who had access to the coverage plan within the last 6 hours. How short? 4 names, she looked at him. Tell me. He looked at her for a moment, not with hesitation. Splitting, with the particular calculation of someone deciding whether the information is something the other person's needs right now, or something that can wait until the adrenaline of the last 40 minutes has finished clearing from the air. He told her. She listened. One of the 4 names was someone she had worked alongside for 14 months, someone who had attended the building's internal security briefing that afternoon, because their role made that briefing routine. Someone whose presence at that briefing had been so unremarkable that no one had questioned it. She absorbed the name. Is it confirmed? She asked. Not yet. Don't move on anyone until it's confirmed, she said. Same procedure, same documentation, same legal process. I know, I mean it, Ji-hwan. I know, he said again. I heard you the first time you said it, 6 weeks ago. I've been hearing you. She looked at him. He was standing in the fog in the dark, 3 blocks from a pier where the infrastructure of her life for the past 6 weeks had finally resolved into something with legal teeth, and he was looking back at her with an expression she recognized, not triumph, not relief, satisfaction of a man who had protected something he'd been trying to protect. Something quieter than any of those things. Something that had been building for 3 years, in the particular way things build when two people sit across from each other's habits and silences long enough to understand the difference between what the other person says and what they mean. Across the waterfront, a police unit was pulling up to the pier entrance. Sung Min was already walking toward it. There was a great deal of paperwork coming. Statements, recordings, the formal filing of the protective order, the 4th name investigation, the documentation of tonight's additional charges, presence of unauthorized personnel on a commercial pier, phone theft, the police positioning compromise. Diane was going to have a long week. Zurielle looked at the arriving unit, then back at the pier, then at Ji-hwan. I need to give a statement, she said. Yes. And then I need to call Nala. Yes. And then she stopped. Not because she didn't know what came after the statement and the call to Nala, but because after was a word that implied a door closing, and she was standing right at the threshold of it and hadn't fully registered what was on the other side yet. Ji-hwan waited. He was good at that, she'd learned. And then we need to talk about the 4th name, she said. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight you give the statement. You call your sister. You go somewhere safe. My apartment. Somewhere that isn't your apartment, he said. Not tonight. She looked at him. He looked back without pushing it further, which was the thing he'd learned to do, and which cost him something every time he did it, and which she had seen the cost of, and not remarked on, because some things were better left unremarked. All right, she said. She walked toward the arriving police unit, and Ji-hwan stayed where he was, because she hadn't asked him to come, and that was how it worked. Now between them, presence by invitation, distance by respect. A sound the particular discipline of a man who had spent 20 years moving toward every problem he identified, learning that the most important direction was sometimes the one he chose not to take. The statement took 40 minutes. She answered every question, precisely, referenced the recording backup, confirmed the identity of the 2 men Corbin had brought to the pier, one of whom had been located by Sung Min's team, and was now in a very uncomfortable conversation with 2 officers near the service exit, and documented the phone removal and the admission about the police positioning compromise. When she finished, the officer across from her said the case was going to move quickly, given the escalation pattern and the volume of documentation already in Diane's filing. Zurielle nodded. She knew she had built it that way. She came out of the police unit and found Ji-hwan waiting at exactly the distance she'd have expected, which was far enough to be respectful and close enough to be real, and she stood next to him for a moment in the fog that had not lifted, and the night that was considerably later than 10 o'clock now. Her phone, back in her pocket, buzzed with a text from Nahala. Security firm checked in, all clear. Are you okay? She typed back, yes. Calling you in 10 minutes. She put the phone away. She looked at the pier entrance, where the dock lights still glowed against the fog, and where the shape of Pier 32 at night was exactly the shape it would be tomorrow. And the night after, ordinary and unremarkable. A working dock among working docks, indifferent to what had happened on it tonight. The fourth name, she said. Tomorrow, Ji-hwan said. If it's who I think it is, tomorrow, Zurielle. She looked at him. He looked back. She thought about what came next, the fourth name, the protective order hearing, the parallel investigations into Vaughn and Ellis, the additional charges from tonight, the restructuring of Hanul Pacific's physical security infrastructure that was going to consume several weeks, and a significant amount of money, and her direct involvement because she was the one who understood exactly where the gaps were. There was a great deal left to do. But standing in the fog on the San Francisco waterfront at 11:43 at night, just walked off a pier where a man who had spent 6 weeks trying to recover the control he'd lost had discovered that every variable he thought he'd accounted for had been working against him. She understood with a clarity that required no particular processing that the thing Corbin had been trying to reclaim on that pier was not, in fact, available. It had stopped being available the night she left. It had taken 6 weeks and a pier in the fog and 40 minutes of police statements to put that understanding on record. But it had stopped being available the night she left. She looked at Ji-hwan one more time, and something in her chest that had been held at sustained high compression for 6 weeks released. Approximately 1 degree, not all of it, not most of it, but 1 degree, which was enough to breathe slightly differently than she had been breathing. Let's go, she said. They walked away from the pier, side by side, at the pace she set, through the fog and the city lights, toward what came next. The fourth name was Marcus Lind. Zurielle found out officially on Wednesday morning, 41 hours after the pier, when Sung Min placed a folder on Ji-hwan's desk during a meeting that included Ji-hwan, Zurielle, and Hanul Pacific's general counsel. Precise and unhurried woman named Catherine Yu, who had been with the company for 9 years and had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised her anymore. The folder surprised her. Marcus Lind was 44 years old and had worked in Hanul Pacific's Facilities and Infrastructure Division for 6 years. His role covered building systems oversight, HVAC, electrical, network panel maintenance, contractor coordination. He had unrestricted physical access to every mechanical physical access infrastructure space in the building, including the exterior network junction boxes, including the one on the east side where the passive intercept device had been installed. He had attended the internal security briefing the previous Tuesday afternoon as a routine participant. His role made his attendance unremarkable. He had heard the police coverage plan for Pier 32 discussed in a room of 11 people, and within 4 hours, Corbin Dacre had restructured his approach to the pier meeting around information that could only have come from inside that briefing. He had also, as the access audit revealed when it was extended backward 9 months, been the person who had first introduced Corbin Dacre to Vaughn Mercer. Zurielle absorbed that last piece sitting at the conference table in Ji-hwan's office, her coffee going cold in front of her, and let it reorganize everything she thought she understood about the sequence of the previous 6 weeks. Vaughn hadn't been the origin point. He'd been the second layer. Marcus had been running the data pipeline for 9 months since, before the relationship with Corbin ended, which meant the intercept device had been installed while she was still with Corbin, which meant Corbin had been building the surveillance infrastructure before she left, not in response to her leaving. She had thought he'd escalated when she walked out. He had been preparing before she did. She set her coffee cup down carefully on the table. 9 months, she said. The earliest data we can confirm from the device's storage goes back 37 weeks, Sungmin said. She did the arithmetic. 37 weeks ago, she and Corbin had been together. She had been coming to this building every day, managing the executive floor, doing her job, believing that the relationship was difficult, but not yet understanding fully what it was. And 37 weeks ago, someone Corbin had contacted Marcus Lind who worked in facilities, who she had probably passed in the elevator, without registering his face as anything other than building staff, had climbed an access ladder on the exterior of this building and installed a device in a junction box and begun feeding her life to a man she had not yet decided to leave. She thought about all the nights she'd spent in those 37 weeks wondering whether she was being paranoid. All the times she'd second-guessed her own reading of Corbin's behavior, talked herself down from the edge of the recognition that was trying to surface. All the hours of work she'd put into managing a relationship that she had believed was troubled but salvageable, not understanding that one of the reasons it felt so comprehensive, so inescapable, was that it had been engineered to be. He hadn't gotten lucky when he always seemed to know things he shouldn't. He'd built a system to know them. Catherine Houston's Ms. Baptiste. Are you all right? Zurielle looked at her. Yes. She paused. How do we proceed with Marcus? Same as Vaughn and Ellis, Ji-hwan said immediately. His voice was even, but she caught the particular quality underneath it, the restrained edge of a man who had reviewed this file the previous evening and had spent time with it in private before presenting it in a room. HR documentation, formal termination, referral to outside counsel. The physical device constitutes criminal installation of surveillance equipment. That's separate from the employment termination and goes to the DA's office. And it connects directly to Corbin's case, Zurielle said. Yes. The DA's office will coordinate with the detective assigned to the stalking and harassment charges. When does Marcus get notified? HR scheduled the meeting for this afternoon at 2. She nodded. I don't want to be in the building when it happens. She said it without particular emotion, as a logistical preference, and both Ji-hwan and Catherine Yu received it that way. I'll work from the satellite office on Market this afternoon. I'll be back Thursday. That's fine, Ji-hwan said. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, set it back down, and looked at Sung-min's folder on the table between them. 9 months, 37 weeks. She was going to need to sit with that number for a while. Not now, not in this meeting, not in front of 3 other people, but somewhere, later. She was going to have to let herself understand what it meant that the surveillance had existed before the leaving, that the control had been structural before it was reactive, that Corbin had not panicked and escalated when she walked out, but had simply activated something he'd already built. That was not a thought for a conference room on a Wednesday morning. She filed it away with the precision she filed everything, in the part of herself that was not the part that ran logistics and managed documentation and kept her face composed difficult meetings. And she moved on to the next item on the agenda. Marcus Lin's termination meeting happened at 2:14. Zurielle was at the satellite office on Market Street when Sung-min texted her the confirmation, reviewing a property acquisition document she had looked at 4 times in the past hour without retaining most of it. She read the text, set her phone face down on the desk, and looked out the window at the afternoon foot traffic on Market. The particular mix of office, workers and tourists, and people who appeared to be going nowhere specific that characterized the street at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Marcus had not, according to the brief summary Sung-min included in the text, shown much. He'd gone pale when the HR director explained the scope of the access audit. He'd asked for a lawyer before anyone finished reading the referral language. He hadn't said anything about Corbin, or about the device, or about how the arrangement had started. All of that was going to come out in whatever conversation happened between him and his attorney before any official interview. And all of it was going to be documented in a way that contributed to a case that was already, by any measure, comprehensive. She thought about him for a moment, not with sympathy, not with particular anger, either with the exhausted recognition that there were 4 people who had participated in 6 months of systematic surveillance of her life, 3 of whom she could construct at least a partial motivation for, and 1 of whom she might never fully understand. Marcus had been the architect of the infrastructure. She didn't know what Corbin had offered him, or threatened him with, or how the initial conversation had gone. She might never know. She put the phone back on the desk and returned to the acquisition document. She got through 2 full pages before she stopped again. She thought about the 37 weeks. She thought about a specific Tuesday evening, 8 months ago, when she'd come home from work and found Corbin already at her apartment. He'd had a key sitting in the kitchen with takeout containers on the counter, and she'd been surprised because she hadn't told him she was coming home early that day. She'd asked how he knew. He'd said he'd called her office and someone mentioned she'd left. She'd believed it because it was plausible, and she'd been tired, and she hadn't wanted to start an argument about it. She understood now that no one from her office had told him anything. He'd known because Marcus's device had pulled her calendar, which had shown the early departure. She had believed him because she'd been trained over the preceding months to find his explanations plausible. That was how the system worked, not dramatically, not with obvious coercion, but with the slow accumulation of explanations that were always just plausible enough that questioning them felt like the unreasonable response. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. Then she picked up the acquisition document and finished the remaining 6 pages without stopping. The protective order hearing was Friday morning. Diane had prepared her thoroughly walkthrough of the documentation, structure of her testimony, likely questions from Corbin's attorney if he retained one, which he had. The attorney was a man named Fletcher, who had a reputation for taking harassment cases and finding procedural pressure points in the documentation. Diane had reviewed his history and was, she told Zurielle on Thursday evening, not concerned. The documentation is comprehensive, Diane said. The recording from Tuesday night alone establishes continued contact, intimidation of a third party, and admission of knowledge regarding law enforcement positioning that lasts particularly useful is because it demonstrates active interference with a protected person's safety planning. Fletcher's going to look for gaps in the chain of custody for the electronic evidence, but Sung's and team logged everything properly. Cloud backup, Zurielle said, timestamped and authenticated. Your phone carrier's records confirm the continuous upload began at 9:47 Tuesday evening and ran without interruption. The local recording Dacre stopped was a copy of the first 90 minutes. The backup contains everything. All right, Zurielle. Diane paused, which she rarely did. She was a woman who moved through information with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped treating pauses as necessary. How are you? I'm managing. That's not what I asked. Zurielle looked at her phone. She was at her mother's house. She'd gone Thursday evening, as Nala had asked, and was sitting in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in, at a table she'd done homework at and argued at and eaten approximately 1,000 dinners at. And it was the first time in 6 weeks she'd sat somewhere, without checking whether the windows were lockable. I'm not okay yet, she said, but I think I will be. Diane said that's a good answer. How early do we need to be there? 8:30. The hearing's at 9. I'll be there. She was. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. Corbin was present with Fletcher and spent most of the hearing looking at a point slightly to Zurielle's left, which she recognized as an attempt to perform emotional restraint for the judge's benefit. The deliberate avoidance of her face was meant to read as respect rather than what it actually was, which was the particular controlled fury of someone who had not yet accepted that the process underway was not one he could redirect through presentation. Fletcher did find a procedural pressure point, the circumstances of Sung Min's initial security audit, which had been conducted without formal written authorization from a data privacy officer. It was a legitimate point, and Diane had anticipated it, and the response she had prepared addressed it without conceding anything material. The judge listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and moved on. Zurielle testified for 38 minutes. She answered every question directly, without elaboration beyond what was asked, without any visible emotional display that Fletcher could use to suggest instability. She described the bruises, the flowers, the key tag, the rotating phone numbers, the Nala photograph, the peer meeting, the phone removal, Corbin's admission about the police positioning. She described it in sequence, precisely, the way she described everything. At one point, Fletcher asked her whether her employer Hanul Pacific Group had conducted any surveillance or investigation of Mr. Dacre beyond what had been disclosed in the filed documentation. She said, all activities conducted by Hanul Pacific security team in connection with my safety were conducted at my explicit direction within the parameters I established. and have been fully documented in the materials already before this court. Fletcher looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. He moved on. The judge granted the protective order at 11:47. Zurielle sat at the plaintiff's table and heard the language of the order read into the record: no contact, no proximity within 500 feet, no contact with named third parties including Zurielle Baptiste, no contact through intermediaries. Duration 1 year with provisions for extension, and she listened to all of it with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her face carrying the same composed neutrality she'd maintained for 2 hours. When the clerk finished, she exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhalation. It was small and quiet, and Diane, sitting beside her, may or may not have heard it. She picked up her folder and stood up and thanked Diane, and walked out of the courtroom into a corridor that smelled like floor wax and recycled air. She stood there for a moment while the people around her moved past with their own business, their own files, their own versions of whatever had brought them to a courthouse on a Friday morning. She thought, it's done. Then she thought, not all of it. Not even most of it. The criminal charges were pending. The DA's coordination with the detective was ongoing. Vaughn and Ellis and Marcus were all in the process of separate legal proceedings. The restructuring of Hanul Pacific's privacy systems was underway but months from complete. There was a lot of work left, but the protective order was real and dated and on record, and Corbin Dacre was now legally prohibited from being within 500 feet of her, and the document saying so existed in a system that didn't depend on her constant vigilance to maintain it. She stood in the corridor a moment longer. Then she called Nala. The Hanul Pacific privacy restructuring began the following week. Ji-hwan had retained 2 independent cybersecurity firms, an outside employment law specialist, and a physical security consulting company with experience in financial sector building assessments. Zurielle was involved in the initial scoping meetings because she was, as she had told Ji-hwan without particular drama, the person who understood the gaps best. A sound using someone else's interpretation of the gaps when the person who had lived inside them for 6 weeks was available seemed like an inefficient approach to fixing them. Ji-hwan had agreed without argument, which she noted. The first week of meetings was dense technical assessments, access protocol reviews, the physical security audit of every exterior access point in the building, a complete rebuild of the calendar system's permission architecture. Zurielle sat through all of it, asked precise questions, and provided documentation that compressed 6 weeks of her own observation into a format the consultants could use directly. On Thursday of that week, the lead cybersecurity consultant, a woman named Park Ji-soo who had flown in from the firm's Seattle office and had the particular focused intelligence of someone who treated every system as a puzzle she was personally offended by, looked at the access log analysis Zurielle had compiled and said, "This is the cleanest incident documentation I've seen from an internal source. Did you have a background in system security?" "No," Zurielle said. "I have a background in paying attention." Park Ji-soo looked at her for a moment, then nodded once as if this answer was satisfactory, and moved on to the next item. Ji-hwan was in the meeting. Zurielle didn't look at him when Ji-soo said that, but she was as aware that he heard it, the same way she'd been aware for 3 years that he heard most things even when he appeared to be reading something else. After the meeting, he walked with her back to the executive floor without saying anything about Ji-soo's comment, which was the correct response. And she appreciated it the same way she'd been appreciating correct responses from him for 6 weeks quietly, without making it a thing. 3 weeks after the pier, Diane called with an update on the criminal proceedings. Corbin had been charged with stalking, criminal harassment, illegal acquisition of private personal information through a third party, and given the pier meeting and the 2 men he'd brought, criminal intimidation and unlawful confinement of a person. The DA had added a separate charge related to the compromise of law enforcement, positioning through the information Marcus had provided, which Diane said was being prosecuted somewhat aggressively, given the DA's current interest in making examples in organized harassment cases. Marcus had entered a cooperation agreement. In exchange for reduced charges on the surveillance device installation, he had provided a detailed account of how Corbin had approached him through a mutual contact in a construction contracting circle approximately 10 months ago, with an initial request that had been framed as wanting to check on a girlfriend who he was worried was working too hard, and how the arrangement had evolved over 9 months from passive data pulls to active intelligence coordination. The initial framing, wanting to check on a girlfriend he was worried about. Zurielle heard that language when Diane relayed it and didn't say anything for a moment. That was how it was framed to Marcus. That was how Corbin had presented it to someone he needed to recruit, as care, as concern, as a worried partner trying to stay connected to someone who didn't know she needed watching over. The same language he'd used with Zurielle for years, scaled outward to justify surveillance to a third party. "Diane," she said. "Yes. The cooperation agreement, does Marcus's account establish the premeditation, that the device was installed before I left the relationship?" "Yes. The timeline Marcus provided puts the installation at approximately 10 months ago. Your separation from Dacre was 6 weeks prior to Pier 32. The device predates the separation by approximately 4 months. That's in the DA's documentation. It's in the charging documents, yes." She thought about the judge who would eventually look at those charging documents. A Saunak Siebold. She thought about the specific weight of the fact that the surveillance had been built before the leaving, that the leaving had not triggered the escalation, but had simply revealed the infrastructure that was already there. "Thank you, Diane," she said. "I'll have a full written update to you by Monday." "Thank you." She ended the call and sat for a while. She was at her desk on the 31st floor. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 weeks after the pier, and outside the windows the fog was doing what it usually did in the late afternoon, coming in off the bay in slow rolls, softening the bridge cables, turning the city into the particular watercolor version of itself it became on overcast days. She had been at this desk for 3.5 years. She had come to this building as a capable woman with a good career and a relationship that was beginning to feel wrong in ways she couldn't fully name yet. A sound like green wood splitting, and she had spent 3.5 years developing the working language of someone who knew how to move through difficult professional environments without losing the thread of herself. She had spent the last 6 weeks doing something considerably harder than that, maintaining the thread of herself while someone else was systematically trying to cut it. She looked at her wrists. The bruises had been gone for 5 weeks. The conversation she'd been not having with Ji-hwan for 3.5 years happened on a Thursday evening in early spring, approximately 6 weeks after the protective order, because the circumstances had been reorganizing themselves in the direction of that conversation for some time and had finally produced a configuration in which not having it required more active effort than having it. It started with a question that was not about either of them directly. She had stayed late, reviewing the final phase of the privacy restructuring documentation, which was dense and required the kind of sustained attention that made her lose track of the time. And when she looked up, it was 6:40, and the floor was empty except for her and the light still on in Ji-hwan's office. She knocked on his open door. He looked up. "The third phase of the restructuring is complete," she said. "Jisoo's team signed off this afternoon. The physical security audit closes out next week, and then we're done." "Good," he said. He set down the document he'd been reading. "How long did it actually take total?" 11 weeks from initiation to sign-off." She paused. "Faster than I expected. You were directly involved." Jisoo's team was good. "You were directly involved," he said again, without altering his tone, which was just stating a fact, without making a thing of it. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes, I was." The office was quiet. The city outside had the particular quality of a Thursday evening, the week almost done. People moving toward the version of themselves that existed outside of work. The foot traffic on the street below beginning to shift its demographic slightly toward the restaurant and bar crowd. She sat down in the chair across his desk, the one she'd sat in on a Saturday morning 11 weeks ago when she'd told him the rules. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the question you're not asking." He looked at her. "Whether I'm all right," she said. "You haven't asked. In 6 weeks, you've asked me practical things about the documentation, the restructuring, the legal proceedings. You haven't asked whether I'm all right. You told me, in the beginning, Not to treat you as someone who needed managing, he said carefully. I know. I was trying to respect that. I know you were. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. And I'm asking you now to stop respecting it, for approximately 5 minutes. He looked at her. Are you all right? He said. She thought about it. Not the reflexive version, not the I'm managing or I'm functional, that she'd been deploying for 6 weeks as a way of answering the question without opening the space that honest answering required. She actually thought about it, sitting in the chair across from his desk, with the city outside the window going golden, in the late afternoon light. Not entirely, she said. I'm better. The protective order being in place changed something I didn't expect how much it would change, but it did. Having a document that exists in a system I don't have to maintain through constant vigilance. She paused. The thing I'm sitting with right now is the 37 weeks. The duration of the device. The fact that he was building it before I left. I spent a lot of months in that relationship, wondering whether I was reading it wrong. Whether the feeling that something was off was my own perception problem, not a real problem. She looked at the desk. Finding out that the surveillance was already in place during those months it's clarifying in a way that's also difficult. Because on one hand, it confirms that what I was sensing was real. On the other hand, it means I was inside something more constructed than I understood while I was inside it. Ji-hwan was quiet for a moment. That's a hard thing to carry, he said. Yes, it's not your fault that you didn't see the device. I know that intellectually. But you're carrying it like it might be anyway. She looked at him, maybe slightly. He looked back at her with the particular directness that she'd been reading for 3 years, not aggressive, not intrusive, just completely present in a way that a lot of people weren't in difficult conversations. Most people looked slightly away when the content got uncomfortable. Ji-hwan had never once looked away from her. For what it's worth, he said, the device was installed by someone with physical access to the exterior of this building whose job gave him legitimate cover to be there. Sungmin's team didn't find it for 9 months after the fact, and they were specifically looking. You were managing a relationship and a career and your own daily life. The fact that you didn't identify surveillance equipment installed in a junction box on the exterior of your workplace is not a failure of perception. She absorbed that. Thank you, she said, and meant it without ceremony. He nodded once. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The night I told you the rules what I was and wasn't willing to accept from you in terms of how you managed my safety. You agreed to all of it. She paused. That wasn't easy for you. No, he said, it wasn't. I want to understand why you did it. Not the strategic version, I know the strategic reasoning. The actual reason. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk, then at the window, then back at her, and she watched Greenwood splitting, and she watched him do something she'd seen him do, rarely actually search for the honest version of an answer rather than the efficient one. Because you were right, he said, and because he stopped. Started again. I've operated for a long time in an environment where protecting someone means controlling the variables around them. Removing the threat, managing the exposure, solving the problem, without requiring them to participate in the solution. I'm good at that. I've been doing it for 20 years. He paused. You showed me that, in this particular situation, doing it that way would have been a different version of the same problem. The same problem as Corbin. Not identical, but related. Substituting my judgment about what was safest for yours. He held her gaze. If I'd sent someone to handle Corbin in the first week, which I wanted to do, you'd have been safe, technically. And you'd have had the experience of being protected by a powerful man who didn't ask whether that was what you wanted. Which is, more or less, what he'd been doing. She looked at him. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. I know, he said it without pride. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had arrived at an understanding that had cost him something. I won't pretend it was easy to figure that out in real time. But I understood it the moment you said it. When I said, if you take over this situation, you've done the same thing he did. Yes. He paused. You were right. She looked at him for a long moment. There were things in that look that had been accumulating for 3 years, not spoken, not performed, not moved toward, because the circumstances had never quite aligned with the version of honesty that would have been required to name them. She had known for a long time that what existed between them was something more than a functional working relationship, and had chosen, consistently, not to examine it too directly because examining it required dealing with what she found, and she had been, for most of the past year, managing more than she wanted to take on at once. She said, after the pier, when we were walking away, "You stayed at exactly the distance I'd have asked for, if you'd asked." "Yes, you've been doing that for 6 weeks, staying at exactly the right distance." "I've been trying to. I noticed." She paused. "I want you to know that I noticed." He was quiet. "I'm not in a place," she said carefully, "where I'm able to figure out what I want from most things that aren't immediate and practical. I think that's going to take some time."
The last 6 weeks have been...
She stopped, and the word she was looking for didn't arrive immediately, and she let the pause hold rather than filling it with something insufficient. "A lot," Ji-hwan said. "A lot," she agreed. "I'm not asking you to figure anything out," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "I'm telling you that I see it. What you've been doing, and that it means something to me." She paused. "That's all I can say right now." "That's enough," he said. She believed him. She stood up, picked up the restructuring folder from the edge of his desk, and walked to the door. "Good night, Ji-hwan," she said. "Good night," he said. She walked to her desk, gathered her things, took the main elevator down rather than the east elevator, because she no longer needed the east elevator, and walked out through the building's main entrance into the Thursday evening air. She didn't check the street. The spring came the way San Francisco spring always comes, not in warmth exactly, but in a particular quality of light that the winter doesn't have, a brightness that arrives in the mornings, before the afternoon fog reasserts itself, a change in the air that isn't quite temperature, but is something adjacent to it. Zurielle Coast noticed it, one morning, in late March, coming off the elevator, onto the 31st floor, the way the light was coming through the east-facing windows at an angle that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. She noticed it with the particular attention of someone who has spent a long time monitoring their environment for things that shouldn't be there, and has slowly, incrementally, begun to have the surplus attention for things that aren't threats. She had been back in therapy for 6 weeks. This was not something she announced, or discussed with colleagues, or mentioned to Ji-hwan, because it was her own business, and she had a strong preference for managing her own interior life. With the same precision, she managed everything else. Her therapist was a woman named Dr. who worked out of an office on Sacramento Street, and who had the particular quality of someone who listened with genuine interest rather than clinical performance, and who had said to her, in their 3rd session, something that had stuck. The control he had over you wasn't primarily physical. It was epistemic. He controlled what you were allowed to know about your own situation. Zurielle had thought about that for a week. The control had been epistemic. Corbin had built a system that determined what information she had access to about her own life. The device in the junction box, the surveillance of her patterns before she left. The network of people feeding him information that she didn't know was being gathered. All of it designed so that she was operating inside a reality he had partially constructed, while believing she understood the full picture. Leaving had been necessary, but leaving hadn't immediately restored access to the full picture. It had just removed one layer of obstruction. The process of actually recovering the full picture had taken 6 weeks, and a peer and a protective order hearing, and 11 weeks of privacy restructuring and ongoing legal proceedings. A sound like green bling. That was what Dr. Osi meant by the cost. She thought about that on the Thursday morning when she noticed the spring light, standing at the window of the 31st floor with her coffee before anyone else had arrived. And she let herself feel the full weight of it, the 37 weeks, the constructed reality, the months of self-doubt she'd been managed into without collapsing it into something more manageable or less painful. She felt it. Then she went to her desk and started the morning's work. Corbin Dacre's preliminary hearing was in April. Zurielle attended. She had not been required to the DA's office, had her written statement, and the recordings and Diane's documentation and Marcus's cooperation testimony, and her physical presence was not legally necessary at the preliminary stage. She went because she had decided that she was going to be present for every phase of the process she was legally permitted to attend, and because being present was the opposite of hiding, and she was done with the experience of organizing her life around avoiding being seen. She sat in the gallery with Diane on her left and Nala on her right. Nala had insisted on coming. She'd called Zurielle the week before and said, "I'm going," in a tone that reminded Zurielle, again, of their mother. And Zurielle had said all right without arguing, because arguing with Nala when she used that tone was an inefficient use of energy. Corbin was brought in with Fletcher beside him, and he saw Zurielle in the gallery, and for a moment something moved through his face that she watched without looking away from. She had thought about what it would be like to see him in a formal legal setting. She had expected it to be difficult, the particular difficulty of seeing someone you had once loved and then understood differently in a context that made the nature of that understanding fully concrete. She had prepared herself for that difficulty. What she hadn't fully prepared for was how small it was. Not Corbin himself, he was the same physical person, the same unremarkable medium height and dark blue jacket. But the version of him that had occupied so much space in her interior life for 6 weeks, the Corbin who had felt omnipresent and inevitable and capable of reaching into any room she occupied through the infrastructure he'd built, that version had a quality of scale that the actual man standing in a courtroom did not. She kept her eyes on him until he looked away. The hearing was procedural. Fletcher entered a not guilty plea on all counts. The DA's representative outlined the evidence, the judge set a trial date, and the proceeding was complete in 40 minutes. Afterward, in the corridor, Nala took Zurielle's arm and didn't say anything for a moment. Then Nala said he looked scared. "Yes," Zurielle said. "Is that satisfying?" Zurielle thought about it honestly. "Somewhat," she said, "but less than I expected." Nala looked at her. "What I feel mostly," Zurielle said, "is finished with him taking up space." She looked at the corridor, at the people moving past. "That's what I want. Not to watch him be afraid. To stop having him as the primary organizing principle of how I move through rooms." Is it working? She thought about the east elevator. About walking out the main entrance on Thursday evenings. About the morning with the spring light. "Yes," she said. Slowly, but yes. The last conversation that mattered happened on a Friday in late April. Zurielle had stayed late again, she often did, but the quality of the late staying had changed since the pier had shifted from something driven by the anxiety of needing to stay busy into something that was just the natural extension of work she was interested in. She was finishing a property development analysis when she became aware that Ji-hwan was standing in his office doorway, jacket off, the end-of-day version of him that she'd been cataloging for 3 years without fully acknowledging that she was. "You're still here," he said. "So are you. It's 8 o'clock. I'm aware of the time." He came to the doorway of his office and leaned against the frame, which was unusual. Ji-hwan was not a man who leaned against things. He stood or he sat with the precise posture of someone who had long ago internalized the particular body language of authority. Leaning was different, more casual, like something had relaxed in the structure that usually governed the way he occupied space. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. When you told me 6 weeks ago that you couldn't figure out what you wanted from things that weren't immediate and practical, you said it would take some time." "Yes." "How much time is some?" She looked at him. He looked back at her with the complete directness that she had, over 3.5 years, come to understand as one of the most essential things about him, not calculated, not performed, just entirely present and entirely honest about being so. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not finished being angry about the 37 weeks. I'm not finished sitting with what it meant that the system was already in place before I left. I'm not—" She stopped. "There are things I'm still processing that I don't want to skip over because they're inconvenient." "I'm not asking you to skip anything," he said. "I know. I'm asking where I am in the meantime." She set down her pen. "Where you've been," she said, "which is here, at a distance that I determine. Doing the thing you've been doing since the beginning of all of this, which is waiting to see what I need and then providing exactly that and nothing more." He looked at her for a moment. "That's where I am," he said. "Yes. All right," he said. He straightened from the doorframe. "Do you want to ride home?" She looked at him. She thought about all the versions of that question she'd heard from all the versions of people who had asked it, offers of help that carried within them an assumption about what accepting the help meant, about what saying yes obligated her to, about the transactional nature of one person providing something another person needed. She didn't hear any of that in the way he asked it. She heard, "Do you want to ride home?" A practical question about transportation from a man who had learned, over 11 weeks, the extremely specific discipline of offering only what was asked for and nothing he had decided she should want. "Yes," she said. She gathered her things, stood up, and they rode the elevator down together in the comfortable silence of two people who had been through something significant together and were on the other side of it and didn't need to narrate the fact. Outside, the car was waiting. Ji-hwan held the door. She got in because she chose to. He beside her because she allowed it. The driver pulled out into the Friday evening traffic, and the city opened up around them. The bay visible between buildings, the bridge lights beginning to come on in the early dark. The particular San Francisco evening that was neither warm nor cold, but something in between that people who lived there eventually stopped noticing and people who visited found beautiful. She looked out the window. "The 37 weeks," Ji-hwan said after a while. "Yes. For what it's worth, and I understand it may not be worth much because it's not something I can change. I think you were paying attention the entire time. I think you were reading it correctly. I think the system was designed to make you doubt what you were reading, and the fact that it worked for a while doesn't mean your perception was wrong." She looked at him. He was looking out his own window at the city, not at her, which she recognized as the version of saying something honest that didn't require her to respond to it immediately. The statement offered without the pressure of expectation, left in the space between them for her to do with what she chose. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, still looking out the window. They rode the rest of the way in silence. And the silence was the kind that doesn't need to be filled, because it's already full of 11 weeks of careful distance, and one pier in the fog, and 37 weeks she was still learning to carry, and the particular discipline of a man who had spent 20 years moving toward every problem, and had once, when it mattered most, learned to stay still. She looked down at her wrists. No bruises. For weeks now, no bruises, just her own skin in the ambient light of a Friday evening, the wrist she'd been covering with long sleeves since a January morning when a coffee cup had slipped from her fingers and everything that followed had followed. She thought about the morning Ji-hwan had seen them. She thought about him saying, "Don't ask me about my wrist," and him saying I wasn't going to, which was a lie that functioned as courtesy, a soundin', which was the first thing she had understood about how he moved through the world, that he could hold the distance a situation required, even when everything in him wanted to close it. That had been 6 months ago. The car pulled up in front of her building. She gathered her bag, opened the door, and then paused. "Ji-hwan," he looked at her. "Sometimes," she said, "is not forever. I want you to know that." A sound like green wood splitting. He looked at her for a moment with something in his name, because naming it precisely would have required a conversation she wasn't ready to have yet. And he understood that, and he let it be what it was. "I'll be here," he said. She got out of the car. She walked to her building entrance, used her key, went inside. She did not look over her shoulder, not because she had told herself not to, not because she was performing something, but because standing in the lobby of her own building on a Friday night in late April, she simply didn't need to the instinct that had been firing constantly. For 6 months had gone quiet, the way a sound goes quiet when its source is gone. Not gradually fading, but simply absent, and the absence was its own kind of answer. She took the elevator up. She unlocked her door. She went inside and set her bag down and stood in her own apartment in the dark for a moment before she turned the lights on. Because she could, because the dark was just the dark, and nothing lived in it that she hadn't put there herself. Then she turned the lights on. She put water on for tea, and while she waited for it to boil, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the city, the lights, the fog beginning to come in off the bay, the ordinary Friday evening that was happening in every direction around her, indifferent and continuous, and exactly what it had always been. Her phone was in her bag. She did not check it. She poured the tea. She sat down at her kitchen table, the same table she'd sat at the night of the Nala photograph, the night she'd made toast, because Ji-hwan had mentioned food, and she'd realized she hadn't eaten. The night that had felt like the precipice of something she couldn't fully see the bottom of, and she looked at the mug in her hands and thought about everything it had taken to get to a Friday evening in late April, where the tea was just tea and the table was just her table and the window was just a window. She thought about the morning she dropped the coffee mug. She thought about Ji-hwan setting his contract down. She thought about all the mornings and evenings and difficult Thursdays in between. Then she stopped thinking about them. Deliberately, the way you set something down that you've been carrying long enough to know its weight, and she drank her tea, and the city outside her window went on being the city, and Zurielle Baptiste sat in her own kitchen on her own terms in her own life, and the fear that had lived in the walls for 6 months was simply, finally gone.